Good afternoon. The first item of business this afternoon is a statement by Keith Brown on the West Coast Main Line. The Minister will take questions on the end of the statement, and there should therefore be no interventions or interruptions. I call on Keith Brown, Minister, for about 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I am grateful for the opportunity to make a statement on yesterday's decision by the Department for Transport to cancel the award of the Intercity West Coast franchise. I also wanted to have the opportunity to provide as much clarity as is possible in the circumstances on the impact on passengers and also on refranchising of rail services in Scotland. My immediate concern is that passengers themselves are not adversely affected by the Department for Transport's decision. The Department's handling of the procurement process has been incompetent and shambolic. Most importantly, it has caused a great deal of confusion and speculation about arrangements for West Coast services after the franchise handover date of 9th of December. Neither Scottish ministers nor officials were made aware of yesterday's decision in advance of the announcement. I have still to see the detail of the DfT's contingency plan, and it's still not clear who will be operating train services in December. However, after finally managing to speak to the UK Rail Minister, I have his assurance that services will run to timetable using the same trains and staff, and that tickets and bookings made will be valid. DfT ministers stated yesterday that our administrations have a common interest in making sure there is no break in the service for passengers after the 9th of December. While I can understand that, in light of the mishandling of the franchise, many people may be reluctant to give too much weight to DfT assurances. And although our powers in regard to rail remain limited, I am determined that I and my officials will monitor these assurances carefully and offer all assistance necessary to ensure passengers are not disadvantaged. And I hope that this offers some reassurance for passengers, especially as, of course, we'll be approaching the festive and holiday period at that time. But let's be clear, this represents a huge failure in public procurement, and I also want to be clear today about the anger and frustration I feel on behalf of passengers who rely on the West Coast Main Line. The Secretary of State has conceded completely unacceptable mistakes in evaluating bids for the West Coast franchise, mistakes so serious that he's been forced to cancel the current franchising competition. I understand that the flaws were discovered following detailed examination by Department for Transport officials and evidence gathering in preparation for legal proceedings brought by Virgin Trains Limited following the decision to award the franchise to First Group. The Department for Transport has spoken to the 4 bidding companies whose bid costs will be reimbursed, a scandalous waste of public money that could have been avoided if the franchise had been awarded properly. Fresh competition will be started as soon as the lessons of this episode are learned. The Secretary of State has announced a review of the handling of the process to report at the end of the month, and a further review of DfT's wider franchising programme led by Richard Brown, Chair of Eurostar, to report by the end of the year. DfT's 3 live franchise competitions have been suspended. The decision to cancel the award of the franchise has, of course, direct consequences for Scotland, for rail passengers and for the rail industry. The UK Government offered no discussion or advance notice on a decision which directly affects those travelling to and from Scotland and on services which are crucial to the economies of our major cities. I have been asked a number of times if the DfT's actions will have implications for our own rail franchise procurement. And just to be clear, yesterday's announcement is focused solely on the failings and incompetence within the Department of Transport, not Transport Scotland. We are, of course, keen to offer our support for the wider review of franchising. The Deputy First Minister will be seeking to meet the Secretary of State for Transport as soon as possible, and the First Minister has already spoken to the Secretary of State. The reviews and recommendations made will provide lessons for us as well as for the DfT on how risk can be better assessed and on bidding and evaluation processes. But let me reassure Parliament that while lessons will be learned, our franchise procurement process is led by an expert team within Transport Scotland, freely able to draw on external expertise as and when required, and that can only be right given the scale of taxpayers' money involved and the importance of passenger rail services to Scotland's economy and its communities. In our case, it's the largest single government procurement exercise we conduct. No corners are being cut in that process and no false economies are being made. On our current timetable, we are allowing at least 20 months to conduct the formal competition. and over 3 years, including the consultation launched last November. In comparison, the DfT originally conducted a consultation in January 2011 in order to let a contract in April 2012. That's less than half the time that we've allowed for our process. They then delayed that process, but still only allowed 7 months from formal invitation to tender to contract award. We are still awaiting the consultation on the Trans-Pennine franchise, including services to Scotland, despite the fact that it's due to hand over at the same time as the ScotRail franchise, remembering the consultation for that took place last year. That's more than a year behind our timescale. Only last January, I wrote to Theresa Villiers, also no longer at the department, expressing concern over the timescale for the East Coast Mainline franchise, also a vital service for Scotland. And as I set out in June, I will announce more details on the specification of our franchises around the turn of the year. Our more realistic timeline allows us to factor in any lessons learnt as a consequence of the DfT debacle and recommendations made by the independent review commissioned by the DfT. For my part, I am confident of the competence and professionalism of Transport Scotland staff. This government has an excellent track record on procurement, recent examples being the M74 and the Airdrie to Bathgate rail line. We will draw, of course, on the events of yesterday and the forthcoming reviews to maintain our strong record. But without preempting the review, I don't think it's credible to lay all the blame on civil servants. The new Westminster franchising policy has been changed to a preference for 15-year contracts with no break or revenue review clauses. And that policy ignores the difficulty of accurately forecasting revenue over a 15-year period. When I announced the details of the next ScotRail contract, I made clear that the 10-year contract would have an option for a break after 5 years. This will address one of the difficulties the DfT is now experiencing. We will also ensure the sleeper franchise contains appropriate provisions to address the forecast risk and to ensure that the Scottish Government shares in the return on its investment. So I would urge the Secretary of State for Transport to take the opportunity of the review to address these wider questions. It would be a missed opportunity to narrow the review simply down to issues of technical process and not to address wider issues as well. Rather than another patch and mend, a different model is required. The current legislation, primarily the Railways Act of 1993, envisaged a railway that was specified and funded in the public interest, but which was provided by the private sector. The result is a fragmented and an inefficient model. We are doing all that we can in our powers to make this model work as best it can. We are committed to a deep alliance between the operator and Network Rail for the next franchise, and we're taking forward the franchise process in a timely and a competent manner. But in 2012, the current model is not fit for purpose, and I've repeatedly raised concerns with the UK Government on this matter. Yet our powers to give Scotland the rail services it needs are limited by UK legislation. Giving this Parliament the competence to have full legislative control for rail will be the simplest and most effective way of ensuring that the Scottish Ministers have the flexibility to consider the full range of options to deliver rail services in Scotland, including public sector models. This is further evidence of why Scotland needs full responsibility for its own rail services with the powers of an independent Parliament. Thank you.
Members who wish to question the Minister should press the request to speak button now, and I call Oline Murray.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and may I first thank the Minister for an early copy of his statement. This is a fiasco of jaw-dropping proportions, begging the question as to how much David Cameron knew before he reshuffled most of his transport ministers out of their brief. The West Coast Main Line is a vital artery transporting passengers into Scotland, but also enabling people living in places like Lockerbie in my constituency to access work and leisure opportunities in Glasgow. And I hope the Minister will represent all travellers, including those travelling within Scotland, in his discussions with the UK Government. The Minister said he wrote to Theresa Villiers last January regarding the East Coast Mainline service. But given the concerns over the franchising of the West Coast Mainline and its importance to Scotland, when did the Minister first try to contact UK ministers over this franchise? Did he just wait for UK ministers to get in touch with him? Will the Minister join UK Labour in supporting a government takeover of the West Coast Mainline, at least while the contract is being retendered? And does he agree that this debacle strengthens the case for our public rail service being run on a not-for-profit basis?
Minister.
Can I say in relation to some of the points that Elaine Murray makes about political ramifications at Westminster, of course that's important, but what concerns me are the passenger interests that she also mentioned for people travelling in Scotland, and also the implications for the ScotRail franchise. Elaine Murray asked what representations that we've made. Now, I mentioned, of course, a letter to Theresa Villiers. We also wrote to Justin Greening in May 2012. We asked for additional rail powers, not least because we have made the point previously that the franchising process itself is an extremely expensive process, and the level of risk that's there means that we can't get the best return, we believe, for rail passengers. So we've made these points. It's also true to say that on the West Coast Main Line itself, we were told that we had no say in that we had no ability to influence it, although we were asked for our comments, and we made our comments based on improving services coming to Scotland. So within the currently limited powers that we have, we've done everything that we can, that we're allowed to do in terms of trying to influence that process. And perhaps if we had been more involved in that process, we could have given some of the benefit of the experience that people at Transport Scotland have in the way that we've gone about the ScotRail franchise, and that may have helped to avoid this situation. So hopefully, future Westminster governments, if there are, that have any control over Scotland, they will actually listen to what we have to say into Scotland. And I think the fact that they didn't is exemplified by the fact that the first I heard, the first all of us heard, were on the airwaves yesterday. And it can't be right that the memorandums of understanding that we have with the UK government, that the so-called respect agenda that we're told that David Cameron would follow, was thrown out the window at the first chance here. We have to be kept informed, not because we are important people, but because the people that we represent have got a right to proper services.
Alex Johnson.
Can I thank the Minister for advance sight of his statement and begin by congratulating him on the way he's now managed to spend much of the last 36 hours stirring up unjustified concerns over the continuity of the West Coast Rail service. Can I begin by asking the Minister to restate what he said in his statement, that he has now received full assurances that there will be full continuity of service through and beyond this particular hiatus? Can I further ask the Minister if he does not feel a bit guilty about the way in which he's criticised the UK government for not informing him, in his view, quickly enough about these problems, and contrast that with the recent events regarding the EGIP project, when the Minister quite deliberately managed to forget to tell Parliament about that until he made a press announcement 4 days after the start of the recess. I think there is an issue about pots and kettles here. Further, taking the situation rather more seriously about the whole process of tendering for such contracts, is it not a little ironic that the Minister should be so critical of this process when he himself only 2 weeks ago announced that there would be a 3-year interim contract to satisfy the delay in the award of new contracts for the Clyde and Hebridean ferry service, and that kind of foot-dragging and political manipulation, in my view, leaves the Minister standing in a very difficult place? It must at least be spoiling his view from the moral high ground.
Minister.
I think the obvious thing to say is good try, but it's not going to work. And I see we've got a very good turnout, an uncommonly, almost uniquely good turnout from the Tory backbenches. I wonder why that can be. First of all, I have to say to Alex Johnson, if he is going to say that there are unjustified concerns about this process, when it's quite clear across the country people are extremely concerned about this, not least because £40 million of taxpayers' money has been thrown down the drain, and that's just the start. The other processes which have been suspended may also give rise to substantial claims against not the UK government, but the taxpayer. So there's a massive squandering of public resources. And to hear Alex Johnson talk like that, when the slightest hint of what he believes to be misuse of resources in this place, he will shout from the rooftops. But he's got nothing to say about what the UK government has just done. I think people will be appalled with the lack of concern shown by the Scottish Conservatives for people here. But can I also say, in relation to the interim contract, I don't know how he's managed to drag ferries into this, but there you go. The interim contract that he calls it, the new contract that we call it. Can he be certain that the UK government is not going to go to the European Commission and ask for another contract for Virgin Rail on this service? And if that does happen, is he going to criticise them? It would have been very useful, I think, extremely important for the Scottish Conservatives to have said, this is wrong. Whatever else is going on here, it is wrong that the Scottish Government weren't told. It's wrong that the people of Scotland didn't have that level of involvement. And it's a real missed opportunity on the part of the Scottish Conservatives that they haven't done so.
James Donnan, to be followed by John Pentland.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I share the Minister's anger at this shambles and waste of public money. Is the Minister concerned that the incompetence of the UK Government in their handling of this tender could discourage much-needed investment in infrastructure? And how will the Scottish Government ensure this does not affect Scotland?
Minister.
I think it's a very important point, because if you're going to have a system, as we have in relation to franchising for rail, where you rely on the market to be interested in these things, if you treat the market with the contempt that's been shown by the government, if you don't put the resources into being able to properly run that procurement exercise, then of course the market is going to take a look at that. And the real worry now is what we do if we're going to continue to have, under the current government, a market-led, franchise-based system for procuring these services. If you treat the market in that way, and this is not just me saying this, anybody watching the coverage last night will have seen it on TV by all sorts of industry experts, who would want to get into a contract with a Conservative Lib Dem coalition when they run things as shoddily as they have done?
John Pentland, to be followed by Jimmy Hepburn.
Minister, Virgin had promised investment in new services at station upgrades at Motherwell in my constituency. I am naturally keen to ensure that this takes place, whatever the outcome of this current debacle. Will the Minister ensure that support for this development is prominent in any representations that they make?
Minister.
I think the key point really for John Pentland's concern is that the process by which we were to have the Stations Investment Fund, which was the new franchise, is seen to be sound. And obviously crucial to that is the fact that if this review, which has been commissioned by the UK Government, comes back in a couple of months' time, of course at the time where we've taken the leap into the franchising process here in Scotland, and if it suggests fundamental changes to the franchising process, that's where the uncertainty lies. Notwithstanding that fact, it's my intention that we will run a proper, sound process which has the time and the resources which are necessary to make it go through without being risking challenges to it. Now, if that happens, if we have that level of certainty, and if that happens, then the Stations Investment Fund, which I think John Pentland is referring to, should be secure.
Jamie Hepburn, to be followed by Jim Hume.
Following on from John Pentland's question, Presiding Officer, Virgin had also suggested if they had secured the franchise that they would run a service to London which would have called at Cumbernauld Station in my constituency, which would have been greatly welcomed by my constituents. I wonder if the Minister can set out for me that whoever ends up running this service, whoever ends up securing this franchise, the Scottish Government will work with them to see if such a service can be operated.
Minister.
Yes, we will. It's in our interest to do it. It's in the interests of rail passengers. As I've said before, we did make a number of representations during this process to the DfT about improved services in Scotland. We don't even know whether they're listened to because we don't get that kind of response under the current process. But it is my intention to work with whoever operates the service and indeed with the UK Government, because I think there's a great deal they could learn from us. It's unfortunate we're likely to get more cooperation from the UK Government than we are from the Scottish Conservatives in this chamber.
Jim Hume, to be followed by Maureen Watt.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary and the Minister for the sight of this statement. The Transport Minister spoke repeatedly about the regrettable waste of taxpayers' money resulting from this episode, and he's absolutely right. But I remind him that last year it was revealed his officials waste millions of pounds over a tendering process for the relatively small Borders Rail project. With that in mind, what procedures has he ensured are in place to guarantee a smooth and cost-effective bidding process for the vitally important ScotRail franchise in 2014?
Minister.
Well, having heard from Tweedledum, we now hear from Tweedledee. And I have to say, again, it's a real chance for the coalition parties in this Parliament to say, as Patrick McLaughlin has said, there has been a major mistake here, we are sorry for this. Instead, what we get is dragging in ferry contracts and everything else trying to distract people from what's actually happened. Of course it's the case that we will try and work to make sure the ScotRail franchise proceeds in the way that it should, and there's no lack of certainty for both the bidders, because they need that level of certainty that the process that they're entering into has got some integrity to it. Of course we will do that. It's not all in our hands. First of all, we have to run a franchise operation despite the fact that we have major misgivings about that process. But also the review which I've mentioned by the UK Government could fundamentally affect that. So if he's able to put any pressure on the UK Government and his colleagues in that Government who are responsible for the situation, that would also be helpful in making sure we get the right services for Scotland.
Maureen Watt, followed by John Mason.
Can I ask the Minister if he's been in touch with First Group, given it's a major transport company headquartered in Aberdeen, employing thousands of people in Scotland and the rest of the UK, and has taken a severe blow on the stock exchange as a result of UK Government incompetence?
Minister.
Well, of course, the Scottish Government, not least because we haven't been part of the process, can't talk about preferred bidders, and also because they're now about to have a new process for that contract. We can't talk about particular improvements that might be possible as a result of that. But yes, I spoke both to Virgin and to First Group, not just immediately after the award of the contract, because there are implications for both, and we have a good working relationship with Virgin previously and a working relationship also with First Group. I think it is, as the member suggests, an absolute scandal that because of this, a very prominent Scottish company lost a fifth of its stock market value in a few hours yesterday. And of course it's right that we continue to work with First Group, because not least because they currently run the services that we have here in Scotland.
John Mason, to be followed by Margaret McCulloch.
Thank you. I note that the Minister said in his statement that we require a different model going forward. I wonder if he can give us any indication as to whether it's likely that in the interim period it will be a non-profit, government-controlled company that runs the railway, and would he also be seeking powers for Scotland in the future that we could run railways with a non-profit method?
Minister.
Can I say that Richard Baker learned yesterday from my lips that we can actually accept non-profit bids under the current process, having denied it in the interview that we just had before that. But just to confirm to John Mason, it is possible that non-profit organisations can come forward. They do have to be able to demonstrate a level of expertise and experience in running rail services, and there are people in Scotland that can do that. I can't go out and invite them to come forward, but of course they have the ability to do that. As to what the UK Government will do, I really don't know. We don't have any more information. As things stand, I have received no communication about these reviews, other than a letter from the UK Minister, who I tried to get all yesterday morning, and then who eventually phoned back, and having said he was phoning within the next 3 minutes, next 5 minutes, phoned back and said, "I wanted to talk to you because," which I thought was bizarre, given the fact I was trying to talk to him. I got no more clarity on the process of the reviews, other than the fact they will decide them fairly soon, so we still don't know what the scope of those reviews are. And to come back to the point that John Mason made, of course it's the case that we made representations about the nature of franchising and the ability to open that up. We don't have the power to do that, the UK Government does, although there is still the European criteria. You must separate track and train, which is also another constraint that we have to observe. But it is possible just now that we could have not-for-profit organisations that are perfectly free to bid for the ScotRail franchise.
Margaret McCulloch, to be followed by Willie Coffey.
In the space of a week, the Government has gone from defending the process to suspending officials over a blunder that has cost £40 million. Does the Scottish Government agree that the only way to rebuild confidence in the Department for Transport and its tendering process is for there now to be complete and total transparency? And should the UK Government disclose all the relevant documentation, and will the Transport Minister here in Scotland do likewise?
Minister.
Yeah, just to point out, we don't have any documentation relating to this particular bid because we've not been involved in it, as I've mentioned. But I think a general point about the need for transparency as to how the UK Government's ended up in the situation I think, is a good point. And we'll obviously wait and see that the first of the two reviews which has been called for, which is to look at this particular process, obviously we'll wait and see what information is put in the public domain. She might be aware, as I am, that apparently two of the main problems were the fact that passenger numbers weren't properly calculated, and incredibly, that inflation wasn't factored into the figures. These seem to me to be basic requirements of a tendering process, especially if as many people as we're told were involved, not just civil servants, but consultants and others as well, and obviously a great deal of scrutiny by a great number of ministers. So I think it is right that we see as much transparency as possible, not least because we're obliged to follow more or less the same process that they followed, and we want to know what the mistakes that were made were so we can learn from those.
Willie Coffey, to be followed by Patrick Harvey.
It's interesting, I think, that more humility in the subject seems to have been shown by Patrick McLaughlin MP than by some of his Tory colleagues in this Parliament here. But could the Minister seek assurances from the United Kingdom Government, nevertheless, that whatever inquiry is set up will be robust and independent, given that they'll actually be led by Downing Street and real industry insiders?
Minister.
I think that's a very real concern. As I mentioned, the Deputy First Minister will be meeting with the Secretary of State, and I would imagine that will be one of the items on that agenda to make sure that the review processes which have been ordered are robust, because we have to do that. There's a real job to rebuild the confidence of the industry as well as the public that these processes can be conducted properly. So a very important point, and as I say, the First Minister has already spoken to the Secretary of State, and the Deputy First Minister will have an early meeting with the Secretary of State, and I'm sure that point will be raised then.
Patrick Harvey, to be followed finally by Mark Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I thank the Minister for the advance copy of his statement, and I share his dismay at the complacency being shown from the right-hand side of the Chamber over this issue. The fiasco over this franchise arrangement should be indication, if we need more indication, that these rail lines, East and West Coast, should remain in public sector hands. Can the Minister confirm, in relation to the last parts of his statement, if the members in the Chamber would take the matter seriously, can the Minister confirm, in relation to the last part of his statement, whether it is the Scottish Government's intention, if it acquires the powers in this Parliament, to remove the legal barrier to public sector train operating companies?
Minister.
I think on the very first point, I think Patrick Harvey is absolutely right. It's a very serious issue involving a huge amount of money, and yet all we have are distracting attempts by the opposition parties. As I say, within an independent Scotland, and if we acquire these powers, a whole range of different opportunities are available to all the parties in Scotland, and they can put that before the electorate.
The final question is from Mark Griffin. You can take your time with your question, Mr Griffin, and the Minister can take his time with the answer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Unfortunately, for your own timetable, my question is relatively brief, and I'll keep it so for the rest of the members here. Just to ask the Minister, following on from the question from John Mason, what discussions he's had with his officials in Transport Scotland about the possibility for a not-for-profit model of delivery for rail services, and if he himself has any plans to promote that type of service in Scotland.
Minister.
Can I say to the member that there have been substantial discussions in the run-up to the process? I think this point was canvassed also in the consultation process that we carried out well ahead of the procurement exercise that we're about to enter into. So it was canvassed, it was spoken about by myself with officers and others. And it was also the case that there is, I think, with the trade unions as well, they were very interested in this particular aspect. And we have made it clear, the legislation currently does allow us to accept a non-for-profit body coming forward. They do have to have the ability to demonstrate experience in running a rail service, and there's not that many in Scotland, but you can probably think of one or two that might include. But if they can do that, there is nothing to stop them putting forward that process, and there's no barrier. I cannot go and promote a particular bid. The government can't do that. It's got to be seen to be impartial in that respect, but the possibility is there. And just to say, finally, on the point, to help the presiding officer, the point about when we were told about this, I see in today's Daily Mail, a fine newspaper indeed, that calls the reason given by a Downing Street insider as to why it was announced at 1 minute past midnight. The exact quote is, "It was unusual, I think it was, but the Secretary of State decided to act as soon as he was made aware of the facts. It had to be done outside of financial markets. Calls had to be made and key people alerted." Now, I don't know who the key people were outside of perhaps Richard Branson and one or two others, but I think the people of Scotland should have been one of the key people that were contacted. And is that ready contempt that there seems to be for the interest of the people of Scotland, which is one of the most disturbing aspects of this whole episode?
John Scott to the rescue.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Minister, from the discussions so far, are there any immediate lessons to be learned from the Scottish refranchising?
Minister.
Yeah, I think I've mentioned already two of the points. I only know this from reading the media, of course, but two of the obvious points are in relation to passenger numbers and in relation to the calculation of inflation. These are two of the reasons which so far have made it into the public domain, which seem to have caused some trouble. I also have had a number of discussions with Transport Scotland officials, as you can imagine, and, as I've mentioned earlier, with the Minister of State. And I think there are some things which industry insiders would tell you are of concern. The DfT has a vast number of franchises which it's considering. They have changed the franchising process, and there are question marks as to whether sufficient resource went into managing that process within DfT. That's from industry insiders. And the other point is the length of time in advance of this. We had a rail consultation last year well in advance of the franchising process. We've given ourselves a further 20 months. We're very close to starting that process. Obviously, we have to take stock of what's just happened. But yes, of course, any lessons that can be learned from what's happened in this case, we will take on board for our franchise.
Very briefly, Richard Baker.
Can I ask the Minister if he recalls the fact that in our TV interview yesterday, it was I who reminded him that he did completely within his powers pursue a not-for-profit model for the railways in Scotland. And while he cannot actively promote any one bid for not-for-profit delivery, he could indeed promote the concept. And will I ask him to actively promote the concept for a not-for-profit model in Scotland, as indeed I encouraged him to do so only yesterday, which he seems to have forgotten?
Please.
I think the camera doesn't lie, and everyone can see what happened yesterday. That Richard Baker was blissfully unaware of the fundamentals of rail franchising, which is quite worrying. I was happy to set him straight then, and I'm happy to say just now that, of course, we welcome bids if bids come forward from not-for-profit organisations, but we cannot promote individual bids. I think you should also know that. A fundamental of public procurement when it's a competitive exercise is you cannot favour one bid over another. But of course, we would welcome not-for-profit bids as we would any others.
I thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion number 4365 in the name of Angela Constance on employability. Members who wish to take part in the debate should press the request to speak button now. And I think it would be helpful if I remind members that most of our debates are follow-on debates. So if statements or the previous debate finishes early, then we would get to it earlier. I now call on Angela Constance. Ms Constance, you've got 13 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm very grateful for the opportunity this afternoon to open the debate on employability policy. Let me first of all provide some context. When Workforce Plus was launched 6 years ago, there was a focus on developing capacity in 7 areas facing the greatest employment challenges. Since then, I'm pleased to say that local employability partnerships have voluntarily grown up in all 32 local authorities. Supported and often led by local authorities, these partnerships include all of the agencies with an interest in improving employability, from Skills Development Scotland, DWP, to health boards, colleges and, of course, the third sector. And as such, they have been well placed to create more joined-up and effective services for people who are out of work. And at the same time, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government has been doing some joining up of its own. For example, we created Skills Development Scotland out of 4 separate agencies to act as our national skills body. We have also improved the service for unemployed people by making clearer links between the work of Skills Development Scotland and that of DWP through Job Centre Plus. But last but not least, our introduction of single outcome agreements has significantly strengthened the partnership between national and local government in Scotland. And these are changes which I believe put us in a strong position to achieve the jobs and sustainable growth for which we aim. Now, a lot has changed since the introduction of the original employability policy in 2006. Austerity cuts and the global economic downturn, combined with sweeping welfare reforms at UK level, have greatly changed the nature and scale of the challenge that we all face. But these factors emphasise the need for a fresh approach to employability, one in which the continuing challenge of helping people into work is matched by an equal determination to stimulate growth and hence the availability of jobs. And that is exactly the focus of Working for Growth, the refreshed employability framework for Scotland. And this document was launched just 2 weeks ago by my colleague John Swinney when he addressed the Welfare to Work Convention in Glasgow. Now, as the title suggests, Working for Growth has a clear focus on jobs within the context of economic recovery. First and foremost, this means that we must simplify and enhance our offers to employers. And I understand very much the frustration employers still often express at the difficulty of navigating our employment and skills system. Speaking at a business breakfast prior to the launch, I emphasised to a range of employers our desire to work closely with them during these difficult times and beyond, in particular to harness the significant talents of our young people. This commitment is far-reaching and is underpinned by our ongoing development of skills investment plans for our key growth sectors in the economy. Yes, sir.
Gavin Brown.
Just when the Minister gave, I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. When the Minister gave evidence to the Finance Committee in June, she made mention of an online one-stop shop which SDS were developing that would be available in September to try and I suppose, allay some of the fears of employers. Can she update the Chamber on that either now or in the submission?
Yes, absolutely. I'll certainly going to be coming to that later in my speech, but there will be very imminently some announcements with regards to our skills force. But the important point with regards to skills investment plans is that they are developed in partnership with the public, private and third sectors. And I'm pleased to see that two for energy and hospitality have already been developed. And SDS is also, as indicated to Mr Brown, is developing our skills force, a new service which will pull together a range of information related to the workforce needs of employers. Importantly, it will feature details of both national and local offers. And complementing this, we will look to employability partnerships to develop and enhance their own collaborative offers to employers. So then we have a clear strategic focus on jobs within the context of economic recovery. The next step in ensuring clear and effective leadership in support of these goals. As we highlight in Working for Growth, working through the Strategic Forum and the Economy Board will be key to embedding employability more deeply into our efforts to revive the economy. So too will be the work of the reconstituted Scottish Employability Forum, which meets for the very first time this month to be chaired jointly by Scottish, UK and local government. The revised forum will exert much stronger political leadership than before, and as such, I believe it will be well placed to set the national direction and employability in the coming years. And as these joint arrangements recognise collaboration with the UK Government and its providers, it remains essential if we are to effectively help people into work. For example, the introduction of the work programme has been one of the biggest changes to the employment system in recent years, and we will continue to monitor very closely how that is being implemented in Scotland. We also recognise that there is greater flexibility that has been afforded to DWP districts recently, and we see this as an opportunity for more effective integration of services at a local level. But of course, it is people that we are ultimately trying to help, people who, even in the best of times, may struggle to find and sustain employment. And for this reason, a large part of Working for Growth focuses on our desire to help as many people as possible to enjoy the benefits of work. There is only time to highlight some of the things that we are or will be doing in conjunction with a range of partners. So to begin with, as Youth Employment Minister, I naturally recognise the disproportionate impact that the downturn has had on our young people. And our Youth Employment Strategy Action for Jobs sets out the range of short, medium and long-term actions that we will take and are taking to ensure a better future for all young people of Scotland. And we recently announced £15 million for a new employer recruitment incentive for young people, and will use this to leverage in additional funding. And members will also recall the announcement made to Parliament by Alec Neil with regards to the additional £25 million of European Social Fund money. And this is on top of the £30 million we set aside previously to tackle youth unemployment in the period up to 2015. I'm happy to take Mr. Dugdale.
Much welcome the statement that the Minister gave on this issue to create 10,000 jobs. I am looking for a little bit more detail about what that will involve, though I appreciate it's not going to come on stream until next April, but would she be able to tell us today, is this going to be a job subsidy scheme or is it going to take a different track?
Minister.
In effect, it is a wage subsidy scheme. That's what we've got in mind. It will be targeted at the smallest of employers, and we'll look to subsidise a period of employment for, say, 6 months. But that level of detail is not battered down yet. It's very important that I continue my discussions with our partners in local government, because it's very important that this is delivered at a local level, and also with our partners who I met this morning, the Federation of Small Businesses. Yes,
John Park.
For giving way. With regards to that level of support that would go in and obviously helping employee and employer at that time, would there then be an opportunity for the employee to move in, say, a modern apprenticeship? Or would the employee be barred from doing that because they've had the support in terms of a wage subsidy?
Minister.
I think there are many potential models. I mean, I'm certainly familiar with pre-employment training that then links into a wage subsidy programme, whether it's a wage subsidy employment programme or whether it's a wage subsidy programme that's tied to a modern apprenticeship. And one of the things that we will have to discuss with our local partners is to ensure that there's no duplication of resources or services, but if there is opportunities to have a pipeline, to have a progression where we maximise opportunities for young people, first and foremost to get them into work or to secure them on a journey towards work. Presiding Officer, we will also, of course, take forward actions to improve female employment following the success of the recent Women's Employment Summit and the helpful debate on the subject that we had earlier this week. Disability continues to present a challenge, even though it is well documented how minor adjustments in the workplace can, for many people, make all the difference in the world. And figures suggest that access to work is an underused facility in Scotland, and I am keen that we work with the DWP to address this. Yes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A recent FOI request I did into Skills Development Scotland showed that just 0.02% of modern apprenticeships were going to people with disabilities, and that was actually going on a downwards trend. Now, I appreciate it's a difficult task, but I wonder if the Minister had put some thought into how she might increase the opportunities for people with disabilities accessing modern apprenticeship programmes.
Minister.
Absolutely. I mean, there is a range of equality issues that we need to take on board in discussion with our partners and stakeholders. This is work that I have already begun with stakeholders in terms of disability, in terms of race. It is not an easy nut to crack in the sense that we're trying to change cultures and attitudes with some employers within the workplace, but I think there's definitely more that we can do, and I do think much will hinge on us actually raising awareness of our programmes and making more employers aware of the programmes that we offer as a government and how it is in an employer's interest to have a diverse workforce, and there's actually a positive business case that supports diversity, whether it's in terms of young people, women or people with disability. Presiding Officer, mainstream employment is of course the ideal, and we will continue to promote the merits of supported employment approach with regards to that. But at the same time, we do recognise that this approach may not be appropriate for all disabled people. And we have therefore recently commissioned a review of Scotland's supported businesses to be completed by next spring. And the review will focus particularly on how sustainability of such businesses can be improved in a difficult economic climate. And finally, I would highlight the continuing importance of skills in helping people of all backgrounds to access and sustain employment. Evidence suggests that the possession of skills and qualifications is increasingly important in achieving employment of any kind. And for this reason, we are not just maintaining but increasing our investment in skills during the lifetime of this Parliament. These are just some of the ways that we aim, with the help of our delivery partners, to improve people's chances of gaining and sustaining employment. Now, speaking of delivery partners, local partnerships remain central to our goal of improving performance, and that is the reason why we launched Working for Growth in partnership with COSLA. For example, we are well aware of the potential positive impact of community benefit clauses. Increasingly, these are being used to good effect in public sector contracts to secure training and employment outcomes for local residents. And in Working for Growth, we encourage local partnerships to share and to learn from the examples of good practice that are available. And for our part, the Scottish Government will introduce a procurement reform bill as announced in the legislative programme. Among other things, the bill will set an expectation that community benefit clauses will be considered for all major contracts across the Scottish public sector. I think this is a major step forward, Presiding Officer. And finally, Working for Growth sets out some key ways in which we will target our national resources better, and this includes details of a new approach to employability funding, better tailored to the needs of people and local labour markets. The new Employability Fund will see our existing employability investments through Skills Development Scotland and the Scottish Funding Council brought together from next year in a new partnership-led commissioning process. And in developing the fund, we will learn from this year's pilot scheme through which SDS has commissioned job-focused learning from colleges. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, there is much work to be done, but I believe we are well placed to achieve our goals. Alongside our youth employment strategy, Working for Growth is a vehicle through which we can maintain our focus on jobs and growth for Scotland in the coming months and years. And I commend it to you now and look forward to a constructive debate on how we can help more of Scotland's people into work. Thank you.
I now call on Ken McIntosh to speak to Move Amendment 4365.3 in the name of Councillor Dugdale. You've got about 9 minutes.
Thank you. And can I begin by thanking the Minister for bringing forward today's debates. And as is often the case, Presiding Officer, I can't say I disagree with much in the Government's motion before us. Improving people's employability is not just helpful to the individuals themselves, it is potentially at least of wider benefit to business and industry and to our productivity as a country. We will therefore be supporting the Government's motion and the amendment and the request put forward by the Conservatives. Unfortunately, Presiding Officer, as is also often the case, it's what's missing from the motion that causes us greatest concern. The real problem facing our country and our workforce is not employability, but employment itself, or rather the lack of it. Yes, we should support measures to improve employability, but much of that effort will be wasted if we do not do more to help create jobs. There is in fact a line in today's motion which talks of linking employability support with actions to support economic growth in Scotland. But where are those actions to support economic growth? We've just had one of the most half-hearted budgets I can recall in my time in this Parliament, with very little in the way of economic stimulus, and which began to fall apart within hours of Mr Spinney's statement. I'll return to the central issue of unemployment and our wider economy later, but I want to start with something else that is missing, and that's the gap between what this motion says about employability and the actual decisions taken by the Scottish Government, which fail to match that rhetoric. I want to ask the Minister, I'll give way to
John Swinney.
I'm grateful to Mr Mackintosh. I hope in the course of his remarks today he's going to set out in a properly costed fashion what the Labour Party will do different as alternatives to the proposals in the budget which he's just criticised.
Well, as the Minister knows, all amendments have to be framed so that they are properly costed, and I wish the Government had taken the same approach when bringing forward its budget, rather than have it fall apart under examination by SPICE within a couple of hours of it being placed in the library. I want to ask the Minister, how does cutting £38 million from the further education budget improve employability? How does reducing the number of students at colleges by 80,000, that's 80,000 less people accessing a college education in Scotland under this SNP administration, how does that help unemployed Scots back into the workforce?
As Mr Mackintosh well knows, this Government is committed and is maintaining college student numbers at the full-time equivalent of 116,000, the most robust figure that's available.
Okay, Mackintosh.
Well, that's a full-time equivalent, but the Minister didn't answer the point that 80,000 less people are going to college under the SNP now than was the case 2 years ago. 80,000 people denied a place at university. 80,000 people denied the help and assistance they need. Businesses denied the trained employees they need. And worse than that, 1,000 staff laid off at these very colleges. And don't take my word for it. Look to the evidence provided by the EIS and Mary Goodman from the Federation of Small Business at this week's Parliament's Education Committee, who called for more, not less, college provision from flexible provision from Scotland's colleges. And as always, may I add, with the cuts agenda, it is the most vulnerable who are hurt. Across Scotland, parents of children with special needs are frustrated and anxious as the few development courses available to them are restricted, closed or taken away altogether. Now, these are young adults who are amongst the furthest away from the job market, who want to make an economic contribution, who are desperate to improve their employability and to find work, and who want to be valued for what they are capable of, not be excluded because of the extent of their disability. Presiding Officer, this is an immediate and a pressing concern, but the college cuts have the potential to cause even greater damage to our society and to our economy over the longer term. In recent years, one of the most important, and I thought at one point a generally cross-party policy development, has been the drive to reduce the gulf between the vocational and the academic educational option. People should have a genuine choice about how to make the most of their abilities, how to make themselves more employable, not simply be forced down the university route. Now, for that to mean anything, we should be seeing a move to narrow the funding gap between the two sectors. Instead, we are witness to the Cabinet Secretary for Education's naked elitism, a brazen promotion of universities over further education. Colleges are forced to merge, to lay off staff, to close the doors to tens of thousands of Scottish students, and all euphemistically called positive reform to disguise the actual truth of what's happening. This is not the way.
Minister. I wonder if Mr McIntosh would accept, like me, that college education is not just for working class young people, that actually college education is for everybody. And I certainly resent the implication that college education is actually second best, when what we are striving for in our reform programme is parity of esteem, but a reform programme that actually meets the needs of young people in terms of outcomes.
Ken McIntosh.
I'm not sure if the Minister is aware of what's actually happening in education under her watch. Colleges their funding is being slashed. There is no parity of esteem. The drive towards parity of esteem has been lost. And not only that, colleges are for everyone. Colleges certainly are. They're about lifelong learning. But under this SNP administration, they seem to become slowly the preserve of 16 to 19-year-olds. So we are going in reverse under this SNP administration, all the work that we've been achieving over the last few years. That's not the way to create a knowledge economy. It's not the way to promote skills and manufacturing, and it's not the way to improve employability. Now, even on the employability programme itself, can I ask the Minister this? Why is there such a lack of partnership between the Scottish Government and the Department for Work and Pensions work programme? Now, I accept I accept her assurances in the motion before us today that she's keen to promote employability partners. But as I understand matters, anyone who starts on the work programme is now automatically ineligible for Scottish Government assistance or any other support, such as skills or literary training. The Minister is keen to intervene. Please answer that.
Cabinet Secretary.
I would encourage Mr McIntosh to think carefully about the arguments at a time of enormous constraint in the public finances of ensuring that one government does not duplicate the activities of another government. Now, I could speak to United Kingdom Government ministers. I would invite them to do so, and they will find that the UK ministers perfectly prepared to explain that we address our programmes to certain groups of the population for which we have responsibility, and the UK government takes forward their programmes for the groups of the population for which they have responsibility, and we avoid duplication. It's a sensible use of public money.
Ken McIntosh.
There is a difference between avoiding duplication and partnership. And the key here is, if you're a young person in Scotland, and you're getting ESF funding for some of your skills and training, if you then have to go on a work programme, you automatically stop that training, automatically lose that skills, automatically get forced onto this programme. That is not a partnership approach. Can I just suggest, the Minister, before I take an intervention, can I suggest the Scottish Government has now entirely and effectively pulled out of employability for all the long-term unemployed. She's left the long-term unemployed solely up to the UK Government. I'll take an intervention for the Minister.
Cabinet Secretary.
The reason that the work programme is a design of the United Kingdom Government to tackle the issues of long-term employment for people who have been out of the labour market for more than 9 months. I'm sure people would come to us. I'm sure the Auditor General would have questions for me as to why we were putting in place a programme that duplicated one that was available from the United Kingdom Government within their competence. That's the sensible and efficient use of public money. It's why we can balance a budget, and that lot haven't got a clue how to do it.
Yet again, why is it when the Minister makes his interventions, it sounds to me not like a reason but an excuse? Young people in Scotland They want a joined-up approach from all agencies of government. They've not. What they've actually got is the Scottish Government abdicating responsibility and saying, we will not help young people in this situation. And yet, long-term youth unemployment is the serious problem facing our economy at the moment. The number of Scotland's unemployment rate is higher than the rest of the UK, and long-term youth unemployment is now 4 times greater than just a year ago. So there's nobody here, sure, in this chamber who's not heard about the scarring, the long-term scarring effect of a prolonged period of unemployment in a young person's life. And yet the Scottish Government is pulling out of this programme entirely. So we can agree that improving the employability of young unemployed adults can help. Tackling some of the barriers to unemployment, such as transport, providing childcare, and yet again, here's a gap between what the Scottish Government say about these matters on childcare and what they're actually doing, which is very little. But surely, the most important action of all for this government is to boost the economy and to reduce unemployment itself. And that is not happening. At the moment, Presiding Officer, how long have I got, Presiding Officer? All right, sorry. Presiding Officer, on apprenticeships, on employment, on the National Employment Programme, I have to say we're yet to hear any detail of what this National Employment, and there's a lot of eagerness to find out what's in this National Employment Programme. It matters a lot if this is actually the central plank, a flagship programme of this government, or whether it's something that's been hurriedly pulled together at the last minute for this budget, because I have to say it sounds more the latter than the former. But it's very important that we have a flagship employment programme, a wage subsidy programme, to get young people back into work, because employability does help, but employment is the biggest answer of all. I move the motion in Kezia Dugdale's name.
I now call on Gavin Brown to speak to and move amendment number 4065.2. Mr Brown, you've got 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think this is a very, very important debate, and I think it was very timely that the Scottish Government put this before the Parliament for today's debate. Particularly timely given the state of the economy, not just now, but what it is predicted to be like for the rest of this year, next year, and possibly further beyond. We have high unemployment in Scotland, in the UK, in most countries in Europe and in the United States, but we have particularly high youth unemployment, both here and in the rest of the UK. The figures are pretty stark when you have youth unemployment of about 24%, for ages 16 to 24. When you then look at 25 to 34, it's 7.5%, 35 to 49 is 5.4%. So the stark contrast amongst the age groups, I think, is particularly poignant, looking at the size of the youth unemployment cohort. And any government, whether it's in Scotland, in the UK or elsewhere, has this very difficult balancing act to achieve in the actions that it takes. All of us want quality and quantity at the same time. But within the finite funds available to apply to the budget given to the particular minister leading the debate today, there's a decision to be made about how much of it invested in quantity, trying to just get as many people as possible off the out the dole queue and back into work, but also trying at the same time to focus heavily on the type of people that we heard about that are furthest away from the labour market, who have been out of work for months or years, because at times like these, when you have such high youth unemployment, those who are furthest away from the labour market have a real problem. They get swept away by the tide of other people moving into unemployment. I accept that the intentions of the Scottish Government in appointing a youth employment minister were very well intentioned, the idea of having a minister dedicated to that. I acknowledge the budget and the figures that were mentioned by the Minister in her opening remarks. And I think I also have to acknowledge that many of the areas that affect unemployment and youth unemployment in particular are not under the control of the Scottish Government or indeed even the UK Government. We are affected by what goes on in Europe and elsewhere in the world. However, for the purposes of this debate, I think it is worth focusing in on where we do have powers and the various schemes that have been put forward for the Scottish Government. And I do want to just go into a bit of the detail of some of the initiatives that have been put forward and just, I think, pose some questions, not for putting criticism out there for the sake of it, but for just looking at how things might be applied in 2013-14 and 14-15 as opposed to what has happened in this first year. And the first one I think that is really important, is the first part of our amendment, is to think very, very carefully about the type of initiatives that we put forward and the criteria for deciding which initiatives we run with. There will be dozens upon dozens of potentially good ideas, and if you had a budget of £1 billion to focus on the problem, you might run with all of them. With a budget of, at best, if you total everything that Angela Constance said, you're looking at about £70 million, including the European money, £70 million, including the European money. It's not a lot of money to try and fix what is an enormous problem. That's why we have to weigh up very carefully what the money is spent on. And the one issue which I have raised with Angela Constance before, when she did appear before the Finance Committee, was the decision to give £9 million to 6 councils, which was, I think, about half of the Year 1 budget. Now, that decision may turn out to have been a very good decision. Once the money is applied, once the results of it come in, we may, with hindsight, look at it and say, that was a great decision, we should have done more of it, or let's do more of it in following years. Where I have a difficulty with it was this, was that the decision was taken to apply the money to the councils before any agreement was made on what would actually be done. Simply giving money, whether it's to councils or to any other part of society, without working out what it is you're trying to achieve or do with that money, I don't think it is wise policy practice. What I would like to know is what else was considered. I'm very happy to take it in.
Minister. I think, as you know, for the record, Mr Brown, I think I'm sure would have reported to committee that I, was participating in conversations with COSLA, and we do already, I feel, have a good grasp of the type and nature of programmes that work. We also have an imperative to get money quickly to those areas most acutely affected. Now, I accept that there are always lessons to be learned, but this allocation, given Mr Swinney's stewardship of public finances, was not done in some vacuum.
Gavin Brown.
I quote merely from the record then, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think this is an important point. When Angela Constance was at the meeting with her colleague, Hugh McAloon, the response given was, it was made clear at the time that we would work with them after the announcement of what they were going to do with the money. I do think, in fairness, the record speaks for itself in that regard. And the point I try to make, not to just dwell on that one decision, is that when we're taking decisions on how money is going to be allocated, given the scarcity of money available, we have to be robust on what that money is going to achieve before we get the announcement out there for the sake of it. The second part, though, of our amendment, Deputy Presiding Officer, focuses on the evaluation that will take place on interventions that are made. Is it going to be robust, independent and carefully applied? Because we've heard various announcements, whether it's the £15 million that's going to go forward in April for SMEs, a welcome announcement, of course, but it's absolutely critical that that project is put in place properly so that there isn't duplication with the other schemes that are out there, and also happily give way of yes, thank you.
John Mason.
I thank the member for giving way. I just wonder if you would accept there is a challenge with evaluating, because I certainly support evaluating, but he was earlier mentioning that those further away from the job market need help. I mean, the danger with evaluating is we emphasise too much those who are getting an HND or getting a degree or some of these things. What about the people further away?
Gavin Brown, I can give you about another minute or so.
Well, I'm grateful to that. I mean, I don't think anyone suggests that evaluation is easy, but I think my critique thus far of the various schemes that we put forward, and I know Mr Mason sits on the Finance Committee as well, is that the evaluations we've seen have been very incomplete. In some cases, they haven't taken place at all. In many cases, they're carried out by those who funded the initial project, and of course, all evaluations basically say the project was a great idea. I mean, I think from a Finance Committee point of view, it's been hugely frustrating trying to work out what evaluations have taken place or are going to take place at the end of the various projects. We have to avoid duplication, Deputy Presiding Officer, and we have to make sure that with this scheme in particular for the 10,000 jobs, that it isn't simply going to be money applied to people who were going to take on somebody anyway, and this simply becomes money that goes to them for the 6-month period. Now, that's not an easy problem to fix, and the Cabinet Secretary is shaking his head, and I think we're in agreement it's not easy, but if what is achieved is that people who were going to take on somebody anyway get some money, the net result, the end result, in the end, is no different. And that's a really, really important challenge to get right. I don't think for a second it's easy, but I think it's critical that we do. I'll close out, Deputy Presiding Officer, and move the amendment in my name. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now turn to the open debate, speeches of 6 minutes, but at this stage of the debate I can give a little bit of time for interventions. I call Bruce Crawford to be followed by Elaine Murray.
You know, Presiding Officer, the position of the Labour Party this week has been quite intriguing. Yesterday it was tax, tax, tax. Today it's spend, spend, spend. Yesterday you were talking about taxing learning, taxing health, taxing the elderly and the disabled. And today you're talking about spending commitments after spending commitments. Let's take your motion from today. You can only assume that you want to commit a further spending of £124 million for next year's budget. And unless I get an intervention, I'll take that as a read. Ken McIntosh talked up... Please.
Ken McIntosh.
Can I just ask Mr Crawford, because we heard yesterday a series of invented figures as well, and it started off with further fantasy this morning. Where does he get this figure of £124 million from?
Bruce Crawford.
Add up the two figures in your motion, you'll find it very easily, Ken McIntosh, actually. Very easily found. I think it's a bit like the gap in your budget. The gap in your knowledge of your own motions is pretty obvious. You know, can I just say, Ken McIntosh talked about gaps, but you know, the single biggest gap in the whole rhetoric from Labour is the fact that we never get a single concrete suggestion of where the money to finance their commitments is going to come from. These commitments today, of course, come on top of a plethora of other commitments, and I've got a list of them here. If you want to intervene, I'll give you them all as well. But the facts on the colleges, let's deal with the facts on the colleges, because we've heard a lot of nonsense from Ken McIntosh this afternoon. Between 2007 and 2014-15, we have invested £45 billion pounds in colleges, 45% more in cash terms than under the two previous Liberal-Labour coalitions here in this Parliament. And since 2006-07, the SNP has increased the baseline of college student support by 25%, from £67.3 million to £84.2 million. Ken McIntosh.
Ken McIntosh.
Can I just ask, if there's so much money in our colleges, why is Mr Crawford then suggesting that the £38.2 million cut that I've identified is correct? Is there a £38.2 million cut or not?
Bruce Crawford.
Ken McIntosh, you know, whatever you do and how you dress this up, there's one irrefutable fact as far as college places are concerned, and it's the bottom line about how you get value for money. And that's the fact that we're going to have 116,000 full-time equivalent students, the same as currently existing in this financial year. Let me make a wee bit of progress first. Gavin Brown at least approached his position in a more measured tone, but depressingly, as usual from Labour, there wasn't a single innovative thing in their motion about how they would do things differently. Presiding Officer, you know, this Parliament was brought about to be a hotbed for generating ideas, not to be a moan fest for negative people who lack positive ideas to bring forward of their own. It would be a refreshing change to have some innovative ideas emanating from Labour. You know, last week, I think, or the week before, and Gavin Brown was there, and maybe some others in the Chamber, at the Finance Committee, and we heard from a witness that, God forbid, this current downturn might last for about 20 years. I've got to say, Kezia Dugdale, whose name the motion is, if she remains elected to this Parliament, and we're still in that economic downturn over that period predicted, I hope her party will contribute much more positively to debates. Otherwise, the tone, if it continues, will see Labour consigned to opposition for another 20 years.
Kezia Dugdale.
Presiding Officer, I wonder if the member would recognise that what we're doing is representing the views of our constituents who find it hard to get into college or to find jobs in the construction sector at the moment. That's what we're here to do. Is he seriously telling us there's no one in his constituency awaiting a college place at the moment?
Bruce Crawford.
In my constituency, you've got a college sector that's led the way in terms of reorganisation in the past. It's actually very robust and very strong. And I attended just a couple of weeks ago the opening of a fantastic new £29 million college in my constituency in Stirling. That's the investment that Scottish Government's making in the Stirling area. You know, if I've got this right, Kezia Dugdale in 20 years will be over 50 by the time that her party becomes electable again, Presiding Officer. Now, I know I won't be around to see that in this place, but that will be the facts of the situation if you continue the way you're going. But joking aside, and I want to get onto a more positive agenda about what we can do about employability. And I very much welcome today's debate, and I very much welcome the additional £15 million of funding referred to in the motion in the Minister's name. I also welcome the announcement last week of the Government's third sector and social enterprise challenge fund spread across 24 organisations nationally, meaning that over 2,000 people, young people, will be given a chance to improve their employability. This fund forms part of a unique guarantee in these islands to 16 to 19-year-olds that they will be offered a place in training or education. And I'm very pleased with the Scottish Government has funded this range of projects, all of which will have the aim of helping Scotland's young people into jobs. And I was particularly pleased with the award to Recycle Bike in my own constituency of over £58,000. I'd like to congratulate Recycle Bike, which is an innovative social enterprise that does excellent work, reducing the number of bikes going to landfill, while at the same time creating employment and training opportunities in the Stirling area. It's a success story showing how innovative and out-of-the-box thinking can be used to create and maintain employment, a thing that perhaps Labour could begin to learn from. I hope that Stirling's Recycle Bike will inspire others to establish innovative schemes of this kind in order to provide training and employment opportunities. Other innovative approaches can also make a significant and positive impact on employability. Now, let me just get round to the issue of the apprenticeships in my closing remarks, Presiding Officer, from the motion, because Labour are frankly all over the place in this regard. In our Cuts Commission speech last week, Joanne Lamont said apprenticeships should be cut. She said we need to be honest about apprenticeships. Apprenticeships should be highly regarded as university education. If that means fewer but better quality apprenticeships, we should be honest about this. You know, that'd be okay if it stood on its own, but Labour are all over the place because in the 2011 budget, despite the fact that it included provision for an additional 1,500 apprenticeships that they asked for, they actually voted against that budget. Now, during the deepest recession in years, when the SNP government are delivering a record 26,427 MAs, Labour is calling for a cut to this programme. It is simply incredulous. I commend the motion to you.
I now call Elaine Murray to be followed by Colin Beattie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The timing of this debate is fortunate as the Finance Committee had its local workshops as part of our employability inquiry just last week. And one of those took place in Dumfries, and therefore I was very recently able to listen to the views of the public, private and third sectors in Dumfries and Galloway, and also, very importantly, the views of local people regarding their own experiences of the obstacles in getting into employment. One participant, I think they were from the private sector, made reference to what they called the employability industry, which I think there's a suspicion that may be too many people creating work for themselves, sitting on committees, talking about employability rather than actually creating work for those people who are unemployed. And if we have a look at the Scottish Government's refreshed employability framework for Scotland, Working for Scotland, there's mention of bases, of skills investment plans, the Strategic Forum, the Economy Board, the Scottish Employability Forum, the National Delivery Group, the Third Sector Employability Forum, local employability partnerships, and so on. And it does make the reader wonder how all these organisations interact with each other and if they avoid duplication. Now, last Friday in Dumfries, we heard about the Dumfries and Galloway Local Employability Partnerships Action Plan. Briefly,
Kevin Stewart.
You're talking about duplication, and I'd like you to maybe explain which of these groups you would abolish in their help to get folk into employment. But we heard about a proposal for duplication earlier from Mr McIntosh round about the work programme. Do you agree with his view there?
I think I'll just ignore that. I'm going to ignore that intervention because I've got an argument to place, and that's quite a spurious remark, actually. What I'm saying is that the experience we heard about locally was about work the public sector partnership were doing, setting themselves targets and launching an employer offer, tailoring services and recruitment training and staff retention to organisations' needs. Now, I was impressed when I heard that, but in the next session, which we held with the private sector, unfortunately the private sector didn't seem to have been involved in those discussions. In fact, they actually felt quite threatened by the employer offer initiative, which they felt was treading somewhat on their toes. I felt the public sector organisations may be working better together at the moment, but the impression we were receiving is that sometimes they're not working quite so well with the private sector and the third sector as they need to be able to do. Now, one of the issues raised in all 4 sessions was a number of training schemes and funding streams which were causing confusion. And people were saying to us it can be difficult to keep track of all the announcements of pockets of funding, and sometimes it's unclear whether it's a new announcement or a refresh of a previously announced funding. So I do want to commend the intention in Working for Scotland to develop a single employability fund, because, which I understand to be intended to make more effective use of public sector resources. So I want to give credit where it's due on that. People who are unemployed, particularly those who are experiencing long-term unemployment or are young and have never experienced any experience of unemployment, may require employability support to develop the skills that employers expect. However, the locus should not just be on the supply side. The session we heard in Dumfries on Friday with people experiencing unemployment highlighted the barriers faced by those who seek to work in rural areas. One participant, a constituent of mine in Kellerholm, succeeded in being offered a job in Annan, some 45 miles away. He can get there in 50 minutes by train, but it'll cost him £12.30 a day, and that, along with his loss of benefits, means he would be working for £8 a week. Understandably, he didn't actually take the job. Another participant who works in Dumfries but came from Dalbeattie explained that when she worked shifts, she had to wait until 11 o'clock at night to get her bus home. It didn't matter when her shift in the hotel finished, she just had to hang around and wait that length of time to get home. Others reported difficulties in getting access to work, travelling to work. Childcare also a barrier still, particularly where a job requires shift or weekend working. And some employers are still asking women about their childcare arrangements, which I actually thought was illegal, but is still actually going on. Now, I want to turn to our amendment. And I will say that, of course, we will support initiatives to improve employability, and we recognise the importance of getting people into employment to the local economy. But I think we do need to look at the round, and I have a particular concern about housing. And I know that ministers, and I was going to intervene on, I tried to intervene in the Cabinet Secretary yesterday, but he took Mr Brown instead. We talk a lot about completions of homes, and yes, the statistics for completions of socially rented homes looks reasonably good. I have a concern because I've had a look at the housing starts in the socially rented sector, and these fell from 6,997 in 2009-10 to 6,099 in 2010-11 to 2,948 in 2011-12, and that worries me, because that's houses not coming through the pipeline. And that does coincide with the real terms decrease with the housing supply budget of about 47%. I don't think it's a coincidence. And we also have evidence from the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations that they don't think that they will be able to meet targets. Now, I would say to you, there's also an issue about the level of subsidy. I would ask you one challenge. You say we're asking for more money. I would ask you to discuss this with SFHA. If you can't give them more money, would you look at actually increasing the subsidy? Because there's not much point in having a pocket of money there, which housing associations can no longer access because they can't get the borrowing. They're actually not able to access the rest of the financing package because the banks are putting up interest rates and because of concerns around welfare reform. So I would actually ask you to discuss it, because actually housing is so important. It's not just about the importance of the construction industry to the economy. It's also that those people who live in poor housing in deprived areas are the very people who find it most difficult to get employment. And so in actually helping to solve the housing crisis will actually help to solve some of the employability issues as well. It's an example, in my view, of preventative spend. So I would ask the Cabinet Secretary and his ministers to look at that again, to see how some of those issues might be tackled.
I now call Colin Beattie to be followed by John Park.
Presiding Officer, youth unemployment in Scotland is clearly running at far too high a level at 24.3%. It's little comfort that we're doing better than our European neighbours, such as Spain, where under 24 unemployment is running at a painful 53.27%. The recession, which is the primary cause of this unacceptable unemployment level, represents both a threat and an opportunity. An opportunity because it forces us on an ongoing basis to align our training and to ensure what we are doing, in fact, produces the outcomes anticipated. The key outcome, of course, being a productive job. The Working for Growth framework states that employability partnerships created in 2006 have advanced hugely and are now a key element in efforts to develop employability. This is being strengthened using single outcome agreements, sustainable procurement and community benefit clauses. And I personally feel that more could be done by way of community benefit clauses in public sector contracts to secure local training and employment. Since they were set up by the Scottish Government in 2008, great progress has been made, but I do not think from my own experience as a councillor that some local councils are sufficiently confident in details to make full use of the opportunity. The UK Government's austerity budget is working against Scotland. With full fiscal powers, we could increase capital investment, which would boost job availability. And the Scottish Government has been calling on the UK Government repeatedly to increase capital investment to grow the economy. This view is supported by a growing list of eminent economists who are also calling for capital investment. And I can't understand why the UK Government lacks the basic economic competence in this respect. There has never been a recession where a country has budget cut its way back into prosperity. It failed in the early 1930s, and it's failing again now. We need to bring forward capital projects and help our economy back onto a firm footing. Of course.
Presiding Officer, it was the First Minister who said there's never been a recovery without a recovery in the construction sector. I wonder how he feels about the cut to the housing programme in this country.
Colin Beattie.
Well, the cuts that we're suffering here in Scotland are clearly instigated by the Westminster Government. As I've clearly said here, no country has had its budget cut and been able to grow its way back into prosperity as a result of that. What we need is capital projects that will put us back on a proper footing and enable us to expand our economy. We need to grow our way back into prosperity. The Finance Secretary in his draft budget has made provision for a £180 million investment into construction, skills and the green economy, plus an additional £18 million for skills training support for 10,000 opportunities for small and medium-sized enterprises, plus again an additional £17 million for college education. Now, there's clearly been some success in the Scottish Government's strategy. Of pupils leaving school in 2010-11, a record 87.2% achieved positive destinations, compared with 85.2% the previous year. Modern apprenticeships are also at a record high, with 26,427 delivered at a cost of £72 million, and this is against a target of 25,000 per annum each year of this Parliament. The Scottish Government's Opportunities for All initiative guarantees all young people between the ages of 16 and 19 training or education opportunity if they need. One important key to achieving the necessary outcomes is the involvement of business, both local and national, in designing and implementing both training courses and educational courses. In this way, we can be confident of our young people receiving appropriate training and education which is meaningful to getting a job. There are very encouraging signs that this partnership between businesses and those delivering training and education is increasingly productive and successful, although more, as always, needs to be done. Scotland's economy benefits from improving productivity growth through innovation, and there is a strong culture of collaboration and knowledge exchange between universities, colleges and businesses. Personally, I'm excited at the prospect of the concept of innovation centres being extended across Scotland. And I recently had the pleasure of attending the launch of such a centre at Queen Margaret University, where the university worked in partnership with East Lothian Business Gateway in setting up the centre. And I'm looking forward to watching their progress in the months to come. It's clear there's no one road to successfully achieving employability. Much depends on the individual, their personal goals, their abilities and the market. But it's not just young people in general who need support in achieving employability. There is specifically a major job to be done in helping women into work. Childcare plays a major part, and I know the Scottish Government is committed to transforming childcare in Scotland. The Children and Young People Bill will increase the amount of free nursery education from 475 hours to 600 hours for 3- and 4-year-olds and looked after 2-year-olds. This is the best free nursery package in the UK. But this should by no means be the final aspiration. We must seek the Scandinavian quality nursery provision, and unfortunately we're unlikely to reach that level without having control over our own affairs and being able to manage our own economy. Female employment figures are encouraging, with an increase in women employed of 12,000 between May and July, and this coincides with a fall of 7,000 in female unemployment. There are many strands to employability. There is provision for training and education, which the government can achieve. There are delivery mechanisms which universities, colleges, schools and a variety of training facilities can achieve. There is partnership and cooperation initiatives which business can achieve. There is flexibility and a willingness to succeed, which the prospective employee can achieve. And most importantly, there are shovel-ready projects totalling £300 million, which the UK Government can and must agree to in order that we make real progress on all fronts. Thank you.
I now call John Park to be followed by Dennis Robertson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to speak in this afternoon's debate about employability, an issue very, very close to my heart, and certainly something I focused on my very first contribution here in the Scottish Parliament, which doesn't quite feel like the 5 years ago that it was. The first thing I'd like to say is certainly about the nature of employment in Scotland and the calibre of employers we have, and the role of the public sector as being an exemplar employer. And I think we do have some very good employers in Scotland. We have some very high-skilled jobs in Scotland, but we also have, conversely, a lot of low-paid and low-skilled jobs. And I think that is the real challenge that we have in terms of finding people who want to go into work and then finding them suitable employment routes so that they could stay and work and develop themselves as individuals and as employees. So it's a huge challenge for us. One of the other big issues I really think we're struggling with just now is around the availability of high-quality part-time employment. I know that the Women's Employment Summit a couple of weeks ago were looking into some of these issues, and we had the debate this week. I know from one of my own constituents, who the Minister invited along, Alison Johnson, that there is a real concern about the opportunities that are there for people like Alison, who has a very clearly defined career path, well qualified, has been in a highly skilled job, but doesn't have that opportunity now to go into a part-time, well-paid, highly skilled job and balance the other pressures that she has around her family life. And I think that is not necessarily a role for government to directly influence these things, but certainly for government and perhaps the public sector to say more widely that we need to see more roles like this and we need to see more opportunities created like this in the workplace. Because the reality is, if we don't do it, we're missing out on a whole potential workforce out there. And I think one of the other rather worrying aspects of that, particularly for women trying to enter back into employment, is the issue that perhaps a job share is maybe seen as some sort of alternative career path, instead of looking at high-quality part-time employment as being just the very nature of how their career path might go because of the other pressures that we all have, particularly as young families. The other issue, which I think is really important just now, is about people who are already in work, and I mentioned those in low-paid jobs, and how we develop their skills and develop a culture within employers to promote and develop the skills of the people who already have working there. In my first speech that I mentioned in the Parliament, I said that 70% of people who are in work just now will still be in work in 20 years' time. That figure is broadly similar. And if you think how much the workplace has changed over the last 20 years, the pace of change that we face just now, and the likelihood that the workplace is going to change just as much over the next 20 years, if not more, that's a huge conundrum for government, because it's then down to private sector, voluntary sector and public sector employers to start doing something about the people that they have in work, to make sure that they have the skills, they can move through the pipeline, and those that we're seeking to give employability skills who are out with the labour market get the opportunity to move into the jobs, and the pipeline continues to go on in the way that we want to see it. A big part of that is about making sure that we develop the leadership and management skills within our existing workplace. It was something that we just discussed this afternoon at the cross-party group on skills, about how we better utilise skills in the workplace, and to do that more effectively, you need leadership, you need effective management, but you also need to recognise that you have to develop your leaders and your managers to make that happen. And again, that's a big challenge, and it comes back to the earlier debate and I think the points that Ken McIntosh and Kezia Dugdale raised in their intervention about the fact that college places, college positions, other learning providers are key in that and key in developing these vocational training opportunities, and we can't lose sight of them in the current climate. In terms of this joined-up aspect between what the DWP does and what the role of the Scottish Government agencies are in and around skills, there is an issue out there. I've got a constituent who worked with an employer who found himself, unfortunately, made redundant because that employer went into liquidation. He got the support from PACE, but again, it was reactive. It wasn't proactive, although the support was excellent in the first instance. But then when he was trying to find an appropriate course, the Scottish Government, the SDS support was there for him at that time. He wasn't able to source a course locally. He then finds himself in the work programme, and it is a real challenge there. Now, this is someone who's worked in the same workplace for 25 years, never had to go into the labour market, look for employment, never had to think about his own skills that he needs to develop his employment opportunities. And just when he needed that little bit of intervention at the right time, the system has unfortunately let him down. And I think it's examples like this that we as parliamentarians have to bring to the chamber and hope that we can improve the system for people who are engaged in it. Because if we don't do that, people like my constituent from Cowdenbeath would find himself in this situation much further down the road as well. The final thing I'd like to say is I welcome the commitment that the Scottish Government have made around procurement. I hope it is compulsion on employers to train apprentices, because I think that is very important through community benefit clauses and other measures that we compel employers. And as part of that, what we need to do is look at some of the issues I think that were raised earlier in an intervention from Kes Dugdale about disabled workers and workers who are underrepresented in the workplace. And if we could find measures through procurement to ensure that they get opportunities, that we use government spend to provide opportunities for these groups, I think we'll be doing our job properly. If we don't do that, as I said earlier, we won't maximise the potential of a full workforce. And for that, and if we don't do that properly, Scotland will be a far poorer place. But as parliamentarians, I think we're in the best position to make that happen just now.
I now call Dennis Robertson to be followed by Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I come from a very diverse constituency. In Aberdeenshire West, we have farming, we have tourism, hospitality, and of course the energy sector. Unemployment in the Aberdeenshire area is down as low as 1.3%, and in parts of my constituency it's at 0.6%. Maybe not a reflection of what's happening elsewhere in Scotland. But, Presiding Officer, I would like to look at the link between education and employment. In my own constituency of Aberdeenshire West, there's an excellent model being taught within the schools, Your Future, Your Energy. It gives the opportunity for young people to look at the broad aspect of coming into the employment market. It moves away from the stereotype. Within this project, young girls look at wearing the hard hat and the overalls and going into the offshore market. We've got them looking at the various sciences. We've got them looking at what they can do within their curriculum at the school to look at a future within that broad aspect of energy. We have to move that culture forward to ensure that our young people have the appropriate opportunities. I'm delighted to say, Presiding Officer, that positive initiatives have been taken with the universities and colleges within the Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire area. They've now set up a centre for excellence, looking at that broad market. They're looking at the feed-in from the schools. They're looking at what the skills sector requires and applying the courses that the young people need to get into employment. Employers within the energy sector say there's a skill shortage, and indeed there is. But they're addressing that problem because it's so important to our overall economy within Scotland, within the UK and within the global aspect. But it's unfortunate, Presiding Officer, that much of the return from that energy sector doesn't come direct to Scotland. It goes to the coffers down at Westminster, and our return is very little indeed. Presiding Officer, we're providing the opportunities for our young people. The government has taken a positive step by appointing a minister for our young people to look at the bridge between the education and youth employment. The minister mentioned access to work. One of the UK's best kept secrets, access to work. Who's it available for? What is the criteria? It keeps changing. I don't know, presiding officer, if access to work is available for our young disabled people, for apprenticeships, or when they're trying to learn new skills. I don't think it is. And that's when it's most needed. It's actually needed for the early training. It's needed at the time of them learning new skills. It is there to help our young people achieve work. Presiding officer, it was mentioned that it's a challenge for our young disabled. It's a challenge for all disabled people in the employment market. And we have to try and ensure that every opportunity is there and made available for them. I'm delighted that the Cabinet Secretary within his budget has managed to secure the funding for social enterprises. It's there to enable. It is there to give positive messages to the people of Scotland. Not the negative rhetoric that we've heard from the Labour bench this afternoon. Presiding officer, Bruce Crawford said that in 20 years' time he may not be here. Can I say to Bruce Crawford, he'll be 76 and he'll probably be most welcomed here because he's probably got a more positive message than we've heard from the Labour benches this afternoon. Presiding officer, I'd like to end by saying that the models within Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire, led by ACCEF, the Aberdeen City Shire Economic Forum, are models that could be replicated throughout Scotland. I commend the motion to this Parliament.
Thank you. And I call Liam MacArthur to be followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I too welcome this afternoon's debate, the publication of Working for Growth, and will have no difficulty in supporting the Government's motion at decision time. The motion highlights a number of funding commitments. However, there does appear to be at least some confusion surrounding the way in which funding is being committed. This is a frustration that is felt to a greater or lesser extent by colleagues on the Education Committee, and I'll return to this point later if I have time. But it does suggest that Gavin Brown's call for greater clarity on the allocation of funding is perhaps a sensible one. Likewise, while her amendment is perhaps more strident in tone and certainly unduly critical, I think, of the modern apprenticeship scheme, I think Kezia Dugdale highlights a number of areas where the Government is not adequately yet walking the talk. For that reason, Scottish Liberal Democrats will be supporting the Labour amendment this evening as well. But in general terms, I do believe this is an area of policy where genuine cross-party agreement exists. No one seriously disputes the challenge we face, particularly, though not exclusively, in relation to improving the skills and employability of our young people, not least given the stark statistics quoted by Gavin Brown earlier on. There is even little dispute between the parties over what policy response to these challenges should be, reflected perhaps in the fact that none of the opposition parties sought to amend, but merely to add to what the Minister's motion sets out. In that vein, and as I'm sure we will return to this and related issues many times in the months ahead, can I make a plea to the Minister? While she rightly highlighted the constructive partnerships that have emerged in all 32 council areas, she still seems a little coy about acknowledging the role that the £1 billion youth contract initiative announced by the UK Government last year can play in enhancing employability of young people in Scotland. As she knows, under the programme, UK ministers committed to fund incentives to companies taking on young people, as well as to providing extra support through Job Centre Plus for unemployed 18 to 24-year-olds and an offer of work experience or a sector-based work academy place for every 18 to 24-year-old who wants one. I acknowledge that this may be reflected in the wage subsidies referred to by Ms Constance, but I hope she may agree that in future debates and motions the importance of the Youth Contract Initiative can be exemplified. In terms of the modern apprenticeship scheme, as I said earlier, I think Kezia Dugdale may be overly harsh in her criticism, but I do accept there are concerns around some of the detail of what the Government is doing. The promise to create 25,000 modern apprenticeships each year is undoubtedly an ambitious one, but the Minister has been worryingly vague so far on how this is to be achieved. What proportion of the overall number of apprenticeships would be taken up within the public or indeed the third sector? What demand there is within different parts of the private sector and between businesses of different sizes? The impression is that ministers have arrived at an eye-catching target but are less sure how this target is to be met and where the demand is to come from. The risk is then that the target becomes the primary focus. Yeah, certainly.
Bruce Crawford.
Liam, I wonder, would you accept that not only did the government achieve its 25,000 target, it actually went over that and got to 26,000 plus?
Liam MacArthur.
I mean, I accept what Bruce Crawford's saying, but the point is the make-up of the 25,000 the correct make-up in terms of growing the economy? Are we achieving the target for the sake of achieving the target, or are we putting the interventions where they are most needed? Because this will not ensure resources are invested in the most appropriate place, and that policy intention of ministers is actually delivered. Indeed, the Education Committee heard hints to that effect in evidence earlier this week. Can I make a little bit of progress? I mean, unless, what's timing like?
Well, I can give you a bit of extra time back for your interventions, Minister.
Certainly.
I just wondered, Presiding Officer, if Mr MacArthur would acknowledge that the great strength of the modern apprenticeship programme in Scotland is its employed status, and is the one part of the skills system that I feel responds the best to the needs of employers, in that it's employers who inform the frameworks. I really do think he's kind of looking at this from the wrong angle.
Liam MacArthur.
I don't accept that at all. I mean, she'll recall the exchanges we had at the Education Committee where she was unable to set out in any detail what the make-up between public and private sector was, and that does suggest that the target is apparently being elevated above all else. Changes to the funding arrangements for modern apprentices also appear to be creating some practical difficulties. Understandably, much of the attention has been on meeting the needs of 16 to 19-year-olds, although it's disturbing to note that long-term youth unemployment appears to be 4 times greater than it was a year ago. Nevertheless, clearly for many young people, it's not until they are into their 20s that they decide they want to undertake an apprenticeship, yet changes to the funding rules earlier this year appear to have reduced the level of support for 20 to 24-year-olds to half that available for 16 to 19-year-olds taking up an apprenticeship. It has been pointed out to me by a number of employers in Scotland that encouraging more of those in the older age group to take up apprenticeships and so progress will actually free up opportunities for 16 to 19-year-olds, and the Minister may wish to consider whether further refinement is needed. In the time remaining, however, let me focus on the situation facing Scotland's college sector. In evidence this week, the Education Committee heard from a range of business organisations, all of whom acknowledge the critical role our colleges play in providing the skills our country, our economy needs to emerge stronger from the current downturn. This consensus around the vital contribution made by Scotland's colleges is matched only by the general confusion regarding funding in this area, as I indicated earlier. Professor Jim Gallagher referred to the problem as biscuit tin funding, whereby bits and pieces of money were found to plug gaps or in response to specific issues. As well as making it difficult to see where and how funding was being directed and for what purpose, this approach risked impeding delivery against broader objectives, he said. So far, the more the committee delves into the issue of college and related funding, the more opaque the situation becomes. What is clear, however, is that the present pressure on colleges is significant. As Scottish Colleges confirmed this week, and I quote, "The strong downward trend for teaching funds is a concern in terms of retaining student numbers, breadth of the curriculum and quality of teaching." I acknowledge and welcome the funding announced by Mr Swinney last month and by all accounts by Mr Russell's in front of colleges earlier this week. Nevertheless, as with last year, I think further work needs to be done. This at a time, let's not forget, when colleges are going through enormous upheaval in terms of mergers, etc., while also being required to deliver on a range of commitments. I think the Minister, along with her colleagues, needs to pay particular attention to the discrepancy in funding of higher education courses in our colleges compared to our universities. As well as leaving our colleges short-changed, the message this sends to potential employers is not helpful. It suggests ministers attach less value to college courses, that they are somehow inferior, and this perception risks undermining attempts to improve articulation from college to university and compromises our collective commitment to widening access. I hope, therefore, the Minister will agree to look again at this. Deputy Presiding Officer, as ever, there were many issues I've not been able to cover, but I welcome the fact that Parliament has had the opportunity to debate ways in which we can improve skills and employability. This remains a shared commitment across this chamber, and one on which I believe we can and must continue to make progress. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I call Kenneth Gibson, can I ask members who want to conduct conversations and they know who they are to please go outside of the chamber to do so? I call Kenneth Gibson, to be followed by Margaret McCulloch.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I hope that by outlining concerns echoed by agencies, employers, the third sector and prospective employees and my own constituency and some of the ideas they offered to tackle the issue of employability, some consensus can be reached as to action to ensure that people on the margins increase their chances of getting a job, staying in that job and further progressing in employment.
Mr Gibson, sorry to interrupt. Could you move your microphone round a bit so we can hear you? Thank you.
Apologies, Presiding Officer. This year, I'm sorry, I'm being heckled by the Deputy Convener of the Finance Committee. This year, the Finance Committee, not for the first time, this year the Finance Committee has held a series of oral evidence sessions on the necessity of enriching employability prospects for those on the margins of employment, culminating in the organising of one-day workshops last Friday in 3 regions with high levels of unemployment, including Ardrossan and my own Cunningham North constituency. The central objective of these workshops was to engage with representatives from the public, private and third sectors and individuals who have been through the system to gain a better understanding of the employability landscape. I believe it's worth exploring this evidence. One of the main challenges is lack of cohesion between employers and public sector agencies regarding the type of person employers need. Although there was a general feeling that engagement with employers is better now than it has been in the past, chief among concerns were arguably the complex employability landscape and the competition between bodies at UK, Scottish and local government level. Funding is heavily target-driven and thus an examination of funding models is essential to re-engage with prospective employers and employees as to what is best for them. When asked whether public sector employers were doing enough to help vulnerable individuals enter the labour market, it was clear that more could be done. For example, many NHS staff work less than 15 hours a week and therefore don't qualify for tax credits, a direct impediment to work. Private sector businesses expressed concern at the poor quality of some candidates, with the main barrier cited as a lack of basic capabilities, namely 3 Rs and soft skills. Employment agencies should refocus on quality rather than quantity when it came to referring applicants for jobs. In short, employers believe there is too much emphasis on financial reward for companies who recruit additional staff rather than ensuring the right person is put forward. Cooperation between business and education is needed to ensure that the right attitudes to work are ingrained as early as possible, for example at primary school level rather than 4th year of secondary schools, when opinions to the contrary may already be ingrained in some individuals. In a more positive light, mentoring and work placements were praised as an effective means of developing the right attitude, a prominent example being partnerships between employers and local schools. Placements are largely seen as effective in developing the necessary soft skills such as workplace discipline and organisation. However, it was noted that the DWP is not enthusiastic on endorsing longer-term placements, as their emphasis is in getting individuals into paid employment as quickly as possible. This government understands the importance of engaging with private sector employers to raise awareness of employment options. For example, the British Hospitality Association in improving understanding their industry's prospects, and with the Scottish Retail Consortium in highlighting the extent to which employee skills are constantly upgraded through on-the-job training. Interestingly, in evidence, the third sector echoed the sentiments of the private sector in as much as they agree it's imperative to build confidence and self-esteem of pupils at school. They fully endorse the requirement for employability and entrepreneurial programmes within the school system. Moreover, there was overlap in that voluntary organisations believe employability programmes should concentrate on achieving quality and not targets. It is clear that the third sector wished to see a move away from short-term reactive measures in favour of the long-term, and at the very beginning of our inquiry this was echoed by the STUC, who point out that labour market interventions are stronger in most European countries than the UK and indeed Scotland, and work even when employment is high. Lastly, and perhaps more importantly, were the views of service users themselves. Experience of employability programmes, although in many ways positive, were seen to focus too much on a specific age group, often leaving older individuals feeling excluded. Training programmes are often viewed as mass-produced and not suitable for individual needs. Many told of negative experiences when engaging with the Job Centre and DWP, citing a lack of flexibility and an unwelcoming and intimidating atmosphere. Presiding Officer, the SNP government takes employability matters very seriously and has done much with limited powers to help improve the overall situation. For example, introduction of ambitious pilot schemes to incentivise small businesses to take on graduates in permanent posts, and delivering fully, as we've already heard, on our commitment to offer 25,000 new apprentice opportunities in 2011-12, now exceeded. Opportunities for All is an explicit commitment to a place in education or training for all 16 to 19-year-olds not already in education and employment. We have also developed a regional approach for colleges to make the sector more efficient and receptive in line with students' needs. These obligations are reflective of many practical strategies recommended by the IL International Labour Organisation in their 2011 policy brief, primarily delaying the exit of young people from formal education and strengthening the link between education and training systems and the world of work. Going forward, lessons can be learned from the experience of other European countries. For example, the Netherlands introduced a scheme in 2009 where municipalities must offer those aged 18 to 27 years who applied for social assistance either a job or some form of schooling or training or a combination of both. The Investing in Young People Act has undoubtedly contributed to the Netherlands finding itself at the bottom of the pile in terms of youth unemployment rates in Europe. Denmark's latest youth plan categorises employment strategies into age brackets. For example, for 15 to 17-year-olds, all school pupils have to prepare an education plan with their parents, school and youth guidance centre.
Mr Gibson, could you begin to conclude?
Yes, it leads to further education or identities or identifies the pupil would otherwise do, whether it's training, interning or otherwise. These examples are consistent with conjoining education and training and discouraging any early form of education. Presiding Officer, I think we need to do more for older people and for women, but I believe that progress is being made. But I would hope that these issues which the Finance Committee are deliberating on will be recognised and looked at closely by Scottish ministers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call Margaret McCulloch to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Across the UK, around 40% of those who are unemployed are aged between 16 and 25. And as we heard earlier this week, the job crisis and the worrying trends in our labour market are placing women at a particular disadvantage. It can affect different people in different ways, but no matter who you are or what you are, unemployment is a waste of human potential and a social tragedy. If we achieve anything as a Parliament in this session, then we must bring Scotland back to a position where full employment is once again within our reach. It was reported in the press last week that more than 250,000 people have never had a job at all, a figure which has increased in 26 of Scotland's 32 councils as the youth unemployment crisis develops. Long-term unemployment is corrosive. It is demoralising and demeaning to the individual, damaging to society, and as the IPPR says earlier this year, it is a hidden crisis, the real cost of this country's slowest ever economic recovery. Those who became newly unemployed since the crisis began in 2008, and those young people who are entering the toughest labour market in a generation, must not be lost to long-term unemployment, which is running at a 16-year high. It is wrong to say that there are no opportunities at all in the economy. Over the summer, I worked with Job Centre Plus to organise a jobs fair in my region, and we did our best to match up people who were looking for work with employers who were actively recruiting for new vacancies. However, in some parts of Scotland, there are more than 20 people chasing every job, and in what the media have termed employment black spots, there can be as many as 35 people chasing every job. The challenge for the government at every level is to provide real opportunities now, not just opportunities to work, but opportunities to learn and to train and to help our people to upskill until the upturn comes. And we have to strengthen and accelerate the recovery too, with plans and strategies in place to make sure that growth is sustainable and rich with jobs. The Scottish Government must promote, support and improve employability across the board, as well as in key sectors such as construction and hospitality. I welcome the commitment to retain college places, but scratch beneath the surface, and the FE sector is struggling with budget cuts, job losses and growing waiting lists for college courses. Scotland's colleges say that 30% of FE students come from the most deprived areas, rising to 70% in the hardest hit parts of the country. Almost 23% of the student population in Scottish universities are from the 40% most deprived neighbourhoods. That figure isn't good enough, but it's higher than the number who obtain 5 hires from the lowest income deciles at schools, and it shows that for many young people, college is a route into university. I would underline to Chamber the importance of colleges, but the employability infrastructure in Scotland is much wider. I worked with modern apprentices before being elected to this Parliament, and it was a very rewarding career. I could see firsthand how apprenticeships could make a difference, and I will always be a big supporter of the modern apprenticeship programme. But I am also of the view... Yeah, on you go.
Graham Day.
Angus Training Group, located in my constituency, recently announced a 50% increase in modern apprenticeship trainees for this year. That's 67 young people from Paisley to Peterhead coming to Arbroath to train as engineers. So I wonder if the member can explain how her party's assertion in their motion that the Scottish Government's modern apprenticeship programme is failing to produce the necessary skills base for the industries of the future, how this squares with reality.
Margaret McCulloch.
What we've got to look at is the 25,000 modern apprenticeships that are being offered just now. The question is, are those 25,000 new modern apprenticeships this year, or do we have modern apprenticeships that were recruited last year carried forward and included in this figure? So that's a question that we need to look at as well. But I'm also, I'll go back to my speech, I'm also of the view that there are gaps in the programme and the youth employment strategy. There are young people who are not ready for a modern apprenticeship, but who are closer to the labour market than the Get Ready for Work group. In the past, these young people could be supported through skill seekers, but these days I have to question whether there is enough being done for this group. We've also looked at the sectors where we expect employers to provide modern apprenticeships. The majority of businesses in Scotland are small businesses with less than 10 employees, and those businesses host many of our modern apprenticeships. The Government must do everything it can to support those businesses, even as the economy comes through its second recession in 4 years. In evidence to the Finance Committee, the FSB and Minerva People Limited, an independent training provider based in the south of Scotland, both indicated that a single brokerage service would be helpful. And I know the Minister's sort of answered part of this, but I've got another question to ask on top as well. They also call for a one-stop shop where information about recruitment incentives, job placements and apprentices could be brought to one place. My question is when is the single portal, which the Minister mentioned, coming on stream, and how will it help SMEs navigate the system for clarity and with confidence?
You must be closing now, please.
Presiding Officer, we must do all we can to help young people gain and retain employment, and today I have set out some of the ideas as how we can improve our response. But we must keep the economy at the top of the agenda, because in these troubled times, a stable economy, a strong recovery and full employment is something we have to fight for and invest in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on Stuart McMillan to be followed by Alec Johnson. Up to 6 minutes now, including interventions, please, as we're running tight for time.
Okay, thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I welcome the debate this afternoon on what really is a crucial issue for the whole of the country. Now, during the Scotland's Future debate yesterday, I stated that when I was growing up, Inverclyde's economic heart was being systematically dismantled by a Tory UK government. This was at a time when all powers rested with Westminster. Now, I don't believe for 1 minute that we actually want to go back to those dark days. Communities been ripped apart, families split apart, lives wrecked. Now, this and that was the legacy of an uncaring Westminster government that really had little regard for Scotland. Now, at times in this Parliament, when the debate on employability is raised, it usually is a charged affair, and quite rightly so. Now, the younger generation are the future of the country, and if they're not being given an opportunity, then what hope actually will there be? Now, thankfully, this Scottish Government recognises this, and they have invested finance, energy and time into the issue. And they also know that the past measures of UK governments abandoning apprenticeships and introducing schemes like the YTS have left a legacy on the country now. Now, time and time again in the Parliament, the issue of skill shortages are raised and questions about what are the government going to do about it. And we've already heard that mentioned today in this debate. Now, I honestly cannot believe that this Scottish Government are expected in the space of 1 or 2 parliamentary terms to right the wrongs of years of failed policies for our younger people. Now, further to that, Presiding Officer, at times in this chamber, when unemployment statistics are raised, and we have to accept this, it is impossible to get everyone into work for a whole variety of reasons. Now, every one of us will admit unemployment is a huge challenge, and it is. It is a challenge that no government of whichever colour has actually fully dealt with in the past. Now, I know from my own personal experience that in 1997, when I graduated from university, I was unemployed for 6 months. I was overqualified and underexperienced. I obtained a job for 6 weeks in a factory in the run-up to the Christmas period, and that helped me financially, but it also helped me regain some of my lost self-esteem. I had a student loan, which was a debt that I always had in my mind at the time, and I started to put some money towards it. And thankfully, tuition fees actually hadn't been introduced, otherwise that too would have been an additional debt. Thankfully, this SNP government and this Parliament had the courage and the guts to be on the side of graduates when we abolished the dreaded tuition fee, irrespective if it was a front end or back end. I want to highlight a couple of firms from Inverclyde and their experiences. Now, Stepper Technology and its sister company, Marine Engineering Services, have taken on 22 new employees, of which 15 are under 24 years old. This is within the last year. Now, many of the young people have come from a number of welfare to work programmes, including Get Ready to Work, which has seen 16 to 17-year-olds achieve employment. The Managing Director, a guy called Tom Smith, has told me that employers have a duty of care to take responsibility for the future of the young kids within their own community. They are the future, and we, the business community, have a social responsibility to ensure that they are employed and well-trained, and without these important elements, what future would the business community have, and Inverclyde too? I think that touches upon the point that John Park raised earlier on in terms of the social responsibility of employers. Now, I congratulate Tom Smith and his positive outlook on employing young people and his absolute commitment to his social responsibility. Now, the second firm is a bus company based in Inverclyde, McGill's Buses. I've been told that they continually have vacancies, currently 17, and looking for a range of skills, many of them being trained engineers and bus mechanics. Now, the skill shortage that has already been touched upon today, the skill shortage can be due to the past government and college decisions of cutting back on particular training programmes. Now, it's nigh on impossible to fully train up bus apprentices in Scotland, and that in order for a bus apprentice to actually get done, to be fully trained, they actually have to go to one of the hubs of excellence in England. As a result, there really has been a de-skilling of Scotland over the last 20 years in this particular sector. Now, I would ask... Sure?
With regard to the training of bus drivers, the PSV, there are actually organisations in Glasgow that will train them, and I'm sure they're also throughout the rest of the country. And if individuals can get that qualification, then they're actually guaranteed a full-time job.
Stuart McMillan.
You obviously didn't listen to what I said. I was talking about engineers and bus mechanics, not the drivers. Now, I think it's as a result, also I said, there has been the de-skilling within Scotland. Now, I would actually ask new colleges to examine what actually may be an opportunity here to start reskilling some of our younger people again. Now, it's not going to happen overnight, but the de-skilling started long before May 2007. The Presiding Officer, I welcome this debate, and I back the motion in the name of Angela Constance. The £30 million and the additional £15 million in funding is welcome. I think we can all agree that more can be done. Now, if John Swinney's budget wasn't being hammered by Westminster cuts, then he can actually put a bit more money into the pot. I also agree with my colleague, Colin Beattie, and also with John Park's comments earlier too, regarding the thoughts about community benefit clauses. It's imperative that local authority officials fully engage with their use, as this will actually benefit our communities and all of our constituents. Now, I welcome the 26,000 apprentices last year and the commitment for the rest of this Parliament. I welcome the Working for Growth framework and the partnership approach. I welcome the £180 million investment in construction skills and the green economy. But more still needs to be done, but this will not happen overnight. It's not going to happen without the full financial accountability that this Parliament actually needs. To conclude with, Presiding Officer, and I welcome the debate and the actions of this Scottish Government, but certainly we cannot be complacent about our future. Thank you.
Many, many thanks. Now Colin Alec Johnson to be followed by John Mason. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. It's my intention to give a speech this afternoon, which in fact I've given several times before in this chamber, which should make my job easier, but when you consider the fact that nobody's actually understood what I was on about the last couple of times, it becomes necessary for me to repeat it and work hard to ensure that my message gets across. In fact, I was just being reminded last week when we had in the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee with a number of cycling organisations forward giving evidence. And I did remark privately, not on the record, to some of my committee colleagues that, you know, when it comes to effort to promote cycling as a driver for economic growth, Norman Tebbit doesn't get nearly as much credit as he deserves. Because he it was who said that his father when he was unemployed, didn't sit around worrying about it. He got on his bike and he went and looked for work. Now, you might wonder why I choose to mention Norman Tebbit specifically, but the reason I do it is that I'd rather do it myself than wait for somebody else to intervene and do it later on. Because the subject I want to talk about is labour mobility. We've heard a number of people during the course of this debate talk about the employment situation in different parts of Scotland. We heard Ken McIntosh telling me the message that I've heard from so many people in this Parliament, and that is that there's just no jobs. We heard from Margaret McCulloch that in her area there's 20 people chasing every job that comes along. But we also heard from Dennis Robertson, who lives in the same town that I do, that in his constituency there is actually a labour shortage, if not a skills shortage. The truth is that the Scottish economy is very diverse, that there are areas where there is high unemployment, some of the highest unemployment anywhere in the UK. But in Scotland, there are also areas where there is extremely low unemployment and a skills shortage. What we fail to do effectively is ensure that the people without jobs can move, if they choose, to the areas where these jobs might exist. I think at this stage I will advance my argument because, as I said, I've done it before and I want to do it again. Now, the evidence that I have for the fact that there are jobs to be had if you're willing to move and get them, is if we look at Eastern European immigration. Now, let me qualify that, as I've done many times before, by saying that I am one of these Conservatives who is actually very supportive of Eastern European immigration. In fact, I talk to many employers in the North East who say if it wasn't for Eastern European workers, they would have no business at all. So they are very welcome. Yet at the same time, their existence is a demonstration that jobs are available if people are willing to move to get to them. Very briefly.
Stuart Stevenson, I think.
Yes, Stuart.
Thank you very much. I wonder if the member might care to let us know the average number of working people in a family there were when Norman Tebbit's father moved, and I suggest it's close to 1, and the number of working adults there are in a family today, which I suggest is substantially closer to 2. Is the member suggesting that someone with a job should voluntarily surrender it so that they can travel with their partner on the speculative chance of getting a new job?
Not at all. I do have to say that, unfortunately, I don't have these statistics. I don't remember that era. Stuart Stevenson may. However, if I can progress this argument slightly, I don't wish to force anyone to move against their will, but I know that there are people who would be willing to move for work if the possibility was there. And the reason I would suggest that Eastern European workers are willing to move to areas of Scotland where there is a labour shortage, and those unemployed in certain areas of Scotland are less able to move, relates to housing. Now, it is the fact that there are many people in Eastern Europe who come from difficult circumstances who are willing, in order to get a start in a new country, to put up with housing conditions that no one in Scotland would be willing to put up with. Whereas those of us in Scotland, who may be in an area of high unemployment and may have adequate or appropriate housing, are extremely unwilling to give that up in order to move to where there is a job. That's why I suggest that the problem we have in order to deal with, in order to foster labour mobility, is actually related to housing as much as to anything else. Now, we did hear from Elaine Murray about the local difficulties that there are involving transport, and I do acknowledge that transport is also a key issue here, but housing is the one I wanted to concentrate on. Now, if someone wants to move 100 miles or more within Scotland to an area like the North East where there are jobs to be had, then if they're going to a highly paid job and are able to participate in the private housing market, then they will pay through the nose for a house, but they will be able to find a place to stay. If you are at the end of the labour market where you are likely to be less well paid, if you are a young person who perhaps doesn't have the appropriate skills, but can find a job where they may gain these skills, then the opportunity to find housing is virtually zero. In fact, the rules governing the allocation of housing in the 2002 Act means that houses in the North East are likely to be allocated to people on the local homeless register rather than to someone who is moving for a job. And any intermediate housing availability, particularly housing in the mid-market rent, is still heavily oversubscribed. So what I'm suggesting to the Minister is that this is perhaps something that the Cabinet needs to take a more holistic view about. If we are to get people without jobs into the jobs without workers, then we must foster mobility, and housing is a key element of what we must deal with.
Thanks very much. Now call on John Mason to be followed by Anne McTaggart. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I start by welcoming both the funding provided by the Scottish Government, the £30 million previously announced, and now the additional £15 million. And I think the fact that we have a dedicated minister on this subject also brings real focus to the subject. As we look towards the budget for 2013-14, we're getting a very positive reaction for switching resources from revenue to capital spend. However, clearly there's a limit to how much we can do in this regard, or we impact on day-to-day revenue spending. And it's not easy to get that balance right, and I think the Finance Committee will be looking at that in detail in the coming months. However, while there has been too high a level of borrowing in the past, and that was a major cause of our current problems, I think many academics are now arguing that for some capital expenditure in the short term would boost jobs and would boost growth. That is still in the hands of the UK Government, and either they need to move in that direction themselves, or they need to give this country the powers to do so. At the Finance Committee, as I think we have heard this afternoon already, we've been carrying out quite a study on employability, and I think that report is probably due out about the end of November, and we'll have another debate probably after that. Particularly on Friday, it was very useful, as we've heard, that the Finance Committee had a useful day with workshops in Ardrossan, Dundee, and I was privileged to go to Dumfries to be with Elaine Murray and others. And that was hugely informative for me personally, because I must admit I am more used to the urban environment and some of the problems and challenges we face there. And it was really useful to hear of some of the particular challenges they have in the more rural areas, meeting public, private and third sector representatives, and also some of the folk who are actually seeking employment themselves. Issues like transport are very specific often to a rural area, and we also heard of issues such as the need for a training centre for the hospitality sector, which is clearly very specific to Dumfries and Galloway. Other points, however, were relevant for right across Scotland. One of these would be that having people trained for the right jobs is an important issue. And we hear about the North Sea oil sector, other parts of the energy sector as well, and the real need for engineers. And that's where I'm not sure I agree with Alec Johnson's the thrust of his last argument, that it is about mobility, because there seems to be a national shortage of engineers and related skills. And we do have some engineering North Sea companies coming into Glasgow now, but still finding a skills shortage. So we do need to encourage young people to go in that direction. It does seem as a country that we value engineers slightly less highly than they do elsewhere, and perhaps that's an attitude that we need to try and change. Similarly, it's clear that hospitality and tourism are hugely important, both in a city like Glasgow and in a more rural area like Dumfries and Galloway. And again, there can be an assumption that few opportunities come for career progression in the hospitality sector. But I think we have heard repeatedly that there are in fact very good opportunities, and you can go to the top of a very large business in that sector. Talking about schools, we've had comments about soft skills and core skills and the difference between the two. I know the Minister prefers core skills, although we did have an explanation on Friday as to the difference between the two. But it is clear that communication skills, for example, are really important, whether it be the retail sector or in restaurants. Another point which came up on Friday, which has been mentioned already, which I certainly agree with Elaine Murray on, was that the private sector did feel they were not being properly included by the public sector, although we were impressed by the public sector working really well amongst itself. One of the issues we've looked at in the Finance Committee has been young people far from the labour market. Some employers have made comments about that, and their comment was widely publicised that there is a core who are virtually unemployable. I think that was overstated by quite an amount in the media, but there is a reality that some folk do need extra support, and we as a society owe them that. I strongly believe that every person in our society has something to offer. We as a society gain if everyone is contributing, and every individual has the right to feel fulfilled. And of course, for some people, employment is not the right route to that personal fulfilment. But for a youngster who's grown up in a household where nobody works, it is often going to take more than 26 weeks for them really to stand on their own 2 feet in the workplace. On a different line, we have many disabled people who really want to work and contribute to society. And some can cope in a mainstream environment with a bit of support, but others need a greater level of support. And that is why it is so disappointing that Remploy facilities are being closed. I do think in Glasgow very highly of Royal Strathclyde Blindcraft Industries. They have managed to change their product over the years, and I believe they and others have a valuable part to play, and I welcome the Minister's statement that there's going to be a review in that regard. If I can just finally touch on the 2 amendments as we sum up, I think the figure of £124 million has again been mentioned for the Labour amendment as to what they are looking for. And the question that leaves us with is, where is that to come from? The health budget is the biggest budget in the country, and therefore, presumably, Labour are going to take that £124 million off the health budget. Does that mean Labour will be charging people to visit their GPs? Does it mean they will be charging people to stay in hospital, as well as having them pay for life-saving medicines? On the Conservative amendment, of course we all support evaluation and audits, as Gavin Brown was talking about. I'm an accountant, after all, that's what I like doing. But we do know the criticism of accountants for knowing the cost of everything and the value of nothing. If we put all the resources into areas that are most easily measured, there are certain dangers with that. Do we only value college qualifications or university qualifications and not help those who are further away from the workplace, and we need to bring that bit closer? The result of that can be that some of our most vulnerable citizens get left behind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now call on Anne McTaggart, after which we move to closing speeches. Up to 6 minutes, please.
In the Chamber this week, there has been a great level of debate regarding employment. This is an issue affecting the lives of over 500,000 people in Scotland at present, and it is only right that it is afforded such time and attention. Having heard the debate on Tuesday regarding women's employment, it became very clear that this is an issue which should always be of concern to the Chamber. Women in the workplace still suffer discrimination at every level, and it is our responsibility to eradicate this from society. However, as this aspect of employability has already been covered in some detail, I am instead going to use my time to talk about my region, Glasgow, the problems faced in the city and the strategies needed to help the city cope with the economic downturn. Presiding Officer, at present, Glasgow is facing challenges in every sector of the job market. It is imperative that we have strategies in place to allow the city to cope. We know that investment and the injection of cash into our economy will see our growth happen and jobs created. But failing to support struggling areas has taken well over a generation to recover.
Kevin Stewart. Oh.
Yes.
Kevin Stewart.
I thank Ms McTaggart for giving way, and Ms McTaggart was there for part of a visit that I was at the Clyde the other week, and we have seen new companies going in with public and private sector partnerships, including the likes of Glacier Engineering in the East End of Glasgow. Is that not to be welcomed, and does that not show that investment by this government is actually bringing new jobs and investment to the East End?
McTaggart.
Just to reply to Kevin Stewart, all jobs are more than welcome in Glasgow. We are all aware that the times have changed since the 1980s, and so has the job market. We no longer have the major industries in Glasgow. The problem of unemployment has grown more complex. We cannot let the mistakes of the past to be repeated, where young people were thrown on the scrap heap and others never worked again, falling into the trap of benefits. Therefore, it is vital that we all continue to do what we can to stop history repeating itself. If we take a couple of modern examples, it was noted some time ago by Citizens Advice Scotland that rogue employers are now operating in Scotland, offering zero-hour contracts to people desperate for work. The victims of this are mainly low-paid, low-skilled workers, often women working part-time. And while youth unemployment still afflicts 1 in 4 young people in Scotland, it is not only young people coming from school, but graduates looking and failing to find that first step on the career ladder. Complex problems which all politicians need to work together to find solutions. Solutions to eradicate and assist the people involved. Glasgow is working to combat some of these problems, and at present the city is taking notable steps to ensure that the worst effects of the recession are minimised. These include steps such as local economic initiatives, using the third sector to support employment and get people back into work, ensuring that the physical regeneration of the city is used to create jobs and employment, and by having an absolute commitment to eradicating youth unemployment from Glasgow. These are all tough measures from a council committed to fighting unemployment. However, we know that this is not enough. Historically, Glasgow has a legacy of unemployment and benefit dependency. The city still has an unemployment rate of 10.9% compared to only 8.2% for the rest of Scotland. Glasgow needs radical solutions to enable it to flourish and reach its full potential. Greater capital investment spend in projects would have a major impact in Glasgow's economy. This would kick-start the city's construction industry, which is vital if the city's economy is to advance. Presiding Officer, we all want to see employability improve in Scotland. Our economic future is dependent on it. I urge the Government to consider taking steps to assist and enable Glasgow's economy to flourish, and thereafter allow the city to avoid the issues that have so blighted its past.
Thanks very much. We now move to closing speeches, and I call on Gavin Brown, 6 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think we've actually had a pretty wide-ranging, interesting and productive debate this afternoon with members from all parties making some pretty useful contributions and putting them into the mix. I noted particularly early on Elaine Murray talking about the confusing landscape, and it's not easy for employers, particularly smaller employers, to work out what opportunities they are so that they can get involved. I too attended a workshop on Friday in Dundee of last week as part of the Finance Committee, and the point was made there by an owner of a small business that they were the person in charge of HR and health and safety, and they had to do payroll, and they had to win business, and they had to clean the office as well, all at the same time. So in terms of trying to find ways to make it as easy as possible for all businesses, but particularly smaller ones, to engage, I think is absolutely critical. Elaine Murray also talked about the difficulties in rural constituencies in relation to transport. She gave 2 anecdotal examples, but I suspect the problem is far, far wider than those anecdotal examples, and it probably translates across much of the country. My colleague Alex Johnson, I think, talked once again about labour mobility and made some points there that I think ought to be taken on board. John Park, as ever, gave a fairly thoughtful contribution, but particularly focused on skills utilisation and some leadership and management aspects, and again, are sometimes missed. Kenneth Gibson, convener of the Finance Committee, I think quite rightly focused most of his remarks on those furthest away from the labour market. That's an inquiry that the Finance Committee is involved in at the moment, a part that, again, it can be easily forgotten because it's far easier, far quicker and far cheaper to get those who are just on the edge of the labour market back into it than those who perhaps may be several years away from even getting close to it. But we forget them at our peril. Liam MacArthur from the Liberal Democrats, I think, touched on 2 things that probably deserve a bit more exploration, if not today, certainly in the future. A good look at the breakdown of MAs in terms of the distribution between public and private, and also the breakdown within private amongst large companies, small companies and medium-sized companies. I think that breakdown would be pretty helpful so that we have a better handle on it. I note in passing that when this was raised at the Finance Committee, the response given in writing from the Minister was based upon work carried out in 2006. Now, useful as that work was, and may give us an inkling as to where we are today. That is something that I think ought to be updated sooner rather than later. Deputy Presiding Officer, in terms of the key themes, I do have to touch, I think, on the issue of colleges, which featured in the debate. I didn't labour on this in my opening speech purely for the reason that I think the Minister in front of us doesn't have specific responsibility in relation to the budget for that. But it was a key feature of the debate, which I do feel I have to comment upon. There is a cut to the college budget in 2013-14, according to the draft budget. It doesn't matter which way you dress it up. There is a pretty substantial cut from where we were in 11-12. We can talk about how it was well funded in the past. We can talk about how we would like to do more. But the reality is, efficiency savings alone, transformation and mergers alone, even taking all of that into account, there is a cut to the teaching budget in particular for our colleges going forward. It's not just a point made by politicians. Just yesterday at the Finance Committee, Professor Jeremy Peat said, and I'm trying to quote directly, the official report isn't out for that yet, but he stated that he was worried about the resources for the skills development end of further education, as he didn't feel it was sufficiently resourced. Now, if I've slightly misquoted, I apologise there, but I haven't seen the official report there. And it's not good enough, Mr Crawford, to stand up and say we're meeting our manifesto commitments. Because the point is this: since the manifesto was written, the position in relation to youth unemployment has got demonstrably worse. Far, far worse than most of us anticipated. That's the very reason, Deputy Presiding Officer, for having a Minister for Youth Employment. That was a response to the situation. So saying we've simply met our manifesto commitments in terms of numbers is of little comfort to those almost 100,000 people who are sitting out there at the moment unemployed. The other big theme, I think, Deputy Presiding Officer, that was picked up for every party is the frustration of employers. The Minister mentioned it. It was mentioned by all parties. There is a crowded landscape out there. There are many, many initiatives, and for a lot of employers, it is just simply difficult to work out what is going on. So I think it is important, as I requested at the start of the debate, I hope we get an update in the closing speech for the Minister about the SDS skills force, about this idea of a one-stop shop, so that actually if we have this debate in several months' time or several years' time, actually employers start to say there's a difference on the ground. It's not how many initiatives we put out there that matters, it's what employers actually say to us, because only if they are impressed by it, only if it works for them, will it actually work for people who are looking for jobs. And maybe just one final point, which hasn't featured heavily in the debate, but I would be grateful if the Minister could address it even briefly. We heard about the European Structural Funds money, an announcement made in May of this year, about £25 million. In June, Alex Neil, who was a Minister at the time, said very clearly £25 million, now fully approved by Scotland's Programme Monitoring Committee, almost doubles the funding that the First Minister announced in December. Given that it was fully approved in June, can we have an update as to what the position is with that £25 million so that we can see what actions are being taken? I'm very grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before I call on Kezia Dugdale, I would just like to remind members that all members who have taken part in the debate should be present in the chamber for the start of the closing speeches. Kezia Dugdale, 7 minutes or thereby, please.
Thank you. 7 minutes. Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to contribute to this debate. I'd like to make some consensual comments and suggestions to the Minister before addressing some of the points that have already been made. This morning I visited Fort Kinnaird Shopping Park. I'm sure the Minister is familiar with it, in the east of Edinburgh, where there are 1,400 people employed in the retail industry, and today they opened their Christmas jobs fair. It was a very pleasant experience to see the partnership working between the public and private sector in Edinburgh. Fort Kinnaird Retail Park had paid for the big porta cabins to be set up so that they could put computers in to encourage people to apply for jobs. and they had employment advisors, space for them and desks set up so that the public sector could do its bit and provide the careers advisors, the DWP officials and all the people needed to do that partnership working and make it work for the people desperately in need of employment in the East End of Edinburgh. It's going to be there for 3.5 weeks. There are 350 jobs available, and in the first 3 days that it's been open, they've had 450 people through the doors already. So I think that gives quite a good picture of the appetite for Christmas jobs across Edinburgh and just quite what we can do about that. That work has been driven by the Capital City Partnership, which is an organisation I'm sure the Minister is aware of, that I'm hugely fond of. They contribute heavily to Edinburgh's own Joined Up for Jobs strategy, and they're doing some great work there. They would recognise that they have a key role in job creation. I know that's not something the Minister always recognises is within the powers of government to do, but they recognise that they do create jobs, and they do that through two things in their view. First of all, they unlock and they de-risk. It's their view that they have the capacity to unlock latent vacancies that organisations maybe don't know that they have by de-risking the process, taking out some of the challenges that they face. And in doing so, they can do things like provide the recruitment support, they can provide the engagement, they can provide the skills necessary for small, medium and indeed large businesses to take on people that they might not otherwise be willing to take on. And if she's still informing her thinking about how the job subsidy programme could work in the future, I'd very much encourage her to go back to Capital City Partnership and see how they are developing their plans going forward. There's fantastic work coming through the stream, and it's happening because SNP and Labour are actually joining forces in Edinburgh City Council to make some productive things happen. So I say that to her in the most genuine sense about how we can achieve great things together when we listen and interact and engage. One of the things I've been pushing quite hard for in Edinburgh is to see Business Gateway embed itself within the employability arm of what the Council does. And what they're moving to in the future is a one-stop shop for businesses. It's very much what Gavin Brown's been talking about as well. So when a business contacts the Council, yes, they can access recruitment information, engagement information, skills information, but that same person at the shop front at Edinburgh City Council can guide them through the planning process if they're looking to expand their business, that can deal with some of the building control issues or the environmental health issues. Small businesses tell me that this is exactly what they want in terms of being in a position to take on more people, whether they be young or otherwise. And from their perspective, and indeed the Council's perspective, it's a great way of hiding the wiring, is the expression that they put. There's just one person at the front, and you don't need to worry about the mess behind the scenes. All the business needs to do is to access that support at the start. So I would say to the Minister, please go and see what they're doing. There's some fantastic work there. Moving on to today's contributions, I thought Elaine Murray made an excellent point about the difficulty that people have navigating the infrastructure around employability and the desperate need for a one-stop shop. And Margaret McCulloch reminded us that we need to retain the aspiration for full employment in this country, and we should never lose sight of that ambition. And I'd also like to pay tribute to the work, in fact, the leadership. In 1 second, please. I'd also like to pay credit to the leadership that Margaret McCulloch has demonstrated in our own community by organising our own jobs fairs, linking up employment opportunities with the people desperately in need of them. Mr McMillan.
Stuart McMillan.
I thank Kezia Dugdale for taking the intervention. I think that Kezia Dugdale in her opening comment spoke about the event this morning and the Christmas Jobs Fair. Does that not highlight exactly why the whole aspect of and whole kind of future of full employment is not something that's realistic? Because there's always going to be spikes in employment, particularly when it comes to Christmas time.
Kezia Dugdale.
Sorry, President Officer, but I think the member needs to go away and look up what full employment means, because he's not understanding the concept in the chamber today. Bruce Crawford asked me to be more positive, and I'm a very cheery person, I'm a positive person, I tell you. I welcome... I welcomed the money for the Social Enterprise Challenge Fund the first time that the government announced it, and I welcomed it the second time that the government announced it, so it should come as no surprise to Bruce Crawford that I welcomed it the third time that the government announced it last week. Moving on to the issue of the budget, Presiding Officer. Again, I welcomed in the Cabinet Secretary for Finance speech last week the announcement of the 10,000 jobs that could be created, and I welcome the clarification the Minister put forward today that it would come in the form of a job subsidy scheme or a wage subsidy scheme. I would say to her, though, that it was the first thing that Labour called for on her appointment, and 15 months on, it's great that it's happening, but why the delay? And I appreciate we can't hark back to the past, but I have to make that point because I do think it's an important one. The criteria of how that will be allocated is... Sure.
My recollection of the Labour Party's manifesto was a £10,000 jobs fund, but that was all age and it wasn't targeted to young people. But perhaps she would concede that the purpose of my appointment was indeed to marshal all available resources, and I have since doubled and nearly tripled the budget available, which allows us to move forward precisely with an ambitious wage subsidy programme.
Presiding Officer, I'm quite willing to accept that point, and I've encouraged the Minister before to be flexible in her thinking, to roll with the times and adjust to the economic climate that we're faced. She's doing that on youth employment. She's not doing it on apprenticeships, actually, which is the points that we've made in this chamber before, about 10,000 of our 26,000 modern apprenticeships going to people already in work. And on the issue of apprenticeships, Presiding Officer, Graham Day, he's not here, but he raised the issue of how they were... He's hiding. Sorry, I can't see him. Okay, Graham Day raised the issue about the increased number of engineering apprenticeships in his own constituency in Angus. And I very much welcome that, but I have to say to Graham Day, when he looks at the overall figures for the whole of Scotland, the percentage number of engineering apprenticeships for the whole of Scotland has fallen from 13% to 5%, and that's why that line is in our motion today about making sure that the apprenticeship programme matches the future skills needs of the economy. And it's not just in engineering, it's in construction where the percentage has fallen from 22% to 9%, and in electrotechnical modern apprenticeships where it's fallen from 9% to 2%. I'm afraid I've got 45 seconds left, Mr Day. I thought Colin Beattie made some excellent points about procurement processes, and I would encourage him to contribute that into his own government's procurement bill process. You might be interested to know that just 31% of council procurement spend happens in local economies in Scotland at the moment. That's in stark contrast to 39% in Wales and 54% in Northern Ireland. So actually, as a country, we've got a long way to go, and we can look to other nations within the United Kingdom for the lessons on how best to do that. Finally, Presiding Officer, my colleague Ken McIntosh started this debate talking about the devastating impact of college and housing cuts have on the employment agenda, on youth unemployment in the country. That's why we've put the amendment forward today. We will be voting for the government's amendment as outlined before. We simply state the bare facts. It's very hard to do that in the current environment. So I encourage members to vote for our amendment.
Many, many thanks. I now call on Minister Angela Constance to wind up. You have until 5 o'clock, Minister.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I have to offer my apologies to yourself and indeed to Anne McTaggart for my briefly slipping out of the chamber. I'm afraid it has been a long debate, and I have to confess that I've drunk just a little bit too much water. There have been some very notable contributions this afternoon. As always, John Park speaks from a position of knowledge and experience. Dennis Robertson made a resounding contribution, as did Bruce Crawford. And, to be fair, I think Elaine Murray also made a very important contribution, making the link between housing and employability in terms of the wider points with regards to housing. I'll certainly ask Alec Neil to respond to that, but I do have to say that it is this administration that is building more houses than any previous administration. Yeah. I'm not sure about Mr Johnson coming to Parliament and giving the same speech that he's done before. I actually didn't think that was cricket. I thought we weren't allowed to do that. And it's not actually a practice that I think should be encouraged. On a positive note, Presiding Officer, there has been a responsible debate in terms of discussion in and around the statistics. Yes, indeed, there are 10,000 more young people in employment than this time last year. But yes, youth unemployment has risen as it's rising across Europe. And yes, in terms of women's employment, women have the highest employment rate in Scotland in comparison to anywhere in the UK, and women's employment has fallen just over the last quarter. That's not the trend over the last year. And we always have to look at the trends that underlie the headline figures. It's very important to me that when we discuss statistics that we do just accurately tell it how it is and neither conflate the situation, because one unemployed Scot is one too many for me, and I'm sure that's something that we share across the chamber. Now, in terms of the employability refresh, working for growth, I think it can be encapsulated in essence that this has to be about people. It's about our people who are looking for work, and we have to make the most of our collaborations and partnerships to ensure that we get that person-centred response to help people on their journey. And as John Park described, that response can sometimes be rather fractured and unhelpful, and we have to always have to work harder to ensure that our citizens are not passed from pillar to post, and that we do need to be tackling inequality in terms of the barriers that are associated with age, gender and disability. And if we are serious about economic growth, we do also have to be serious about tackling inequality. I think the biggest theme from today's debate was actually about the importance of employers. And I've always been very clear, Presiding Officer, that after the unemployed person themselves, the most important group is actually employers, because there is huge untapped capacity and untapped potential within employers, particularly smaller employers. And I know members are impatient to hear a lot more about our skills force, but it is currently being tested by small businesses, and it will be unveiled very, very soon. Briefly, please.
John Park. I think one of the biggest issues that we face here is the fact that over 95% of our businesses in Scotland are either small or micro. And has the Scottish Government considered how it might pool small employers together, or look at a host employer so that they could have the benefit of training apprentices, which doesn't really exist for a lot of them just now?
I know there are many employers, and I'm thinking in this instance larger employers like Sir Robert McAlpine, who do utilise their supply chains and do work together and nurture and support smaller employers in their supply chain. But I think the other point that John Park actually touched upon, and it is one that Kezia Dugdale also touched upon, is we have to take out the risk for employers. We have to take away the myths and quite often the perceived risks that employers, and often small employers and sole traders, have about recruiting, because we have 200,000 sole traders in this country, and if we could encourage and support more of them with practical support and indeed financial incentives to take on, a young person, that would do a lot, not just for the young person, but also for economic growth in this country. And I'll give way to Ms Dugdale.
In the spirit of consensus in what I mentioned in my speech earlier about the great work happening in Labour and SNP Edinburgh Council, will she come with me on a joint visit to see what's happening at Capital City Partnership so the whole country can learn on what we're doing together in Edinburgh?
I would look forward to that very much indeed. Capital City Partnerships, I'm no stranger to them. But the important point here also, and she touched upon it herself, is that the work and the responsibility that individual members of this Parliament have, and I think Margaret McCulloch is to be commended for organising a jobs fair in her constituency. I also know that Kenneth Gibson is doing exactly the same. I also know that James Dornan is also having a jobs fair this Friday, which I'll be present at. And I very much welcome the comment made by Stuart McMillan about the companies in his constituency in the green area, Stepper Technology and Marine Engineering Services, who are leading the way and taking that step and employing young people. Now, I'll turn just briefly to the amendments, Presiding Officer. I'm not inclined to accept the amendment from the Tory benches today. And I just, well, is it because of your speech, Mr Johnson? Well, there's a little bit more to it than that. It actually struck me as an amendment that was just that little bit mean-spirited, with an implication that we were actually wasting money. And as I intimated to Gavin Brown earlier, I report both to Michael Russell and to John Swinney. And anybody that knows anything about John Swinney, what you have to do to get past him every single penny of expenditure is rather robust. And I'm just so glad that John Swinney's my boss and not my husband. And Mr Russell may laugh, but I spend so much time having to account to Mr Swinney on value of money and how I'm spending my budget that, unlike the Labour benches, I've never had time to read Michael Russell's books. Now, Presiding Officer, if I can turn to the Labour amendment. Now, we have had, an outbreak of consensus in the tone of the actual debate and in the substance of the debate. But as Bruce Crawford said earlier in his contribution, this is a bit of a moan fest of an amendment. And can I just assure all of this chamber that this government is not in denial. We most certainly are not in denial about Tory cuts that are happening right now. So we are making tough decisions, reforming public services such as colleges, but also maintaining our priorities. Full-time equivalent places, 116,000. Exactly. Opportunities for all, an unprecedented guarantee to every 16 to 19-year-old in this country who needs a place in training or education. And perhaps instead of griping, perhaps members across this chamber should be promoting the Opportunities for All helpline 0800 917 8000. Perhaps they could do something too, like Margaret McCulloch and Kenneth Gibson, to actually practically assist young people in their constituency instead of showboating on politics. And with regards to modern
Member really needs to wind up.
I will indeed wind up, Presiding Officer. With regards to modern apprenticeships, Ed Miliband talked a few days ago about wanting more apprenticeships. Last week, Joanne Lamont talked about cutting them. Well, let's have some honest politics. Let's have some honest politics. How many apprenticeships are you going to cut, and in which framework? And you can tell that to 105,000 young unemployed Scots.
Point of order from Jenny Mara.
Officer, in response to my question today, the First Minister told me that these figures, planning backroom bobbies across the country, were nonsense, based on the assurances of Chief Constable Kevin Smith. But this document, planning for backroom posts to be filled with police officers across the country, was written, compiled and sent to the Scottish Government by none other than Kevin Smith himself. Will the First Minister correct the record that this is not nonsense, but is the real plan for backroom bobbies being drawn up by his Justice Department?
I thank Jenny Mara for advance notice that she was going to raise this matter. As I have said many times before, I am not responsible for the content of the First Minister's answers or anybody else's answers. However, your comment is now on the record. Jim Hume.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, on the 31st of August of this year, you wrote to all MSPs, reminding them of their duty to be courteous to other MSPs. And Standing Order 7.3.1 of our Code of Conduct clearly states that, and I quote, "Members shall at all times conduct themselves in a courteous and respectful manner," unquote. Yet today, when replying to the questions at the ministerial statement, not just an MSP, but also a minister, clearly name-called two MSPs in this chamber. Behaviour reminiscent of bullying. Behaviour that would not be allowed in a playground, never mind our first parliamentary chamber in 300 years. Can you give a ruling whether the remarks of the Transport Minister to myself and Mr Johnson in the statement earlier broke the spirit of your letter you sent to MSPs and our standing orders?
I thank the member for his notice of his intention to raise that point of order. Standing Orders Rule 7.3.1 requires members to conduct themselves at all times in a courteous and respectful manner and respect the authority of the presiding officer. I have had the opportunity to review an extract of today's official report, and I would remind all members to refer to other members by their proper names and not to resort to any other form of address. Next item of business is consideration of motion number... Order. Order. The next item of business is consideration of motion number 4380 in the name of Kenny McCaskill on the Defamation Bill UK legislation. That's better. I call on Kenny McCaskill to move the motion. Cabinet Secretary.
Formally moved.
The question on this motion will be put at decision time. There are 4 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is amendment number 4365.3 in the name of Kezia Dugdale, which seeks to amend motion number 4365 in the name of Angela Constance on employability. Be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed. Therefore, we move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 4365.3 in the name of Kezia Dugdale is as follows. Yes, 50. No, 62. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is amendment number 4365.2 in the name of Gavin Brown, which seeks to amend motion number 4365 in the name of Angela Constance on employability. Be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed. Therefore, we'll move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. Of the vote on amendment number 4365.2 in the name of Gavin Brown is as follows. Yes, 52. No, 62. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. The next question is that motion number 4365 in the name of Angela Constance on employability be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 4380 in the name of Kenny McCaskill on the Defamation Bill UK legislation be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. I wish you all a very peaceful recess.